Monsters walk among us every day, evil in human form. We unknowingly pass them without a second thought. You can never be certain who might be watching, waiting for the right moment. In today's video, I'd like to introduce you to Joanne Camille Presti. She was born on March 7, 1969, to Peter and Annette Presti, who lived in Stoneham, Massachusetts. Joanne had 3 brothers, Peter Jr., Steve, and Mark. The Prestis were a close-knit, large Italian family with thick Boston accents. In 1990, Joanne started dating a professional hockey player. He was from the area, he played for the Boston Bruins, and his name is John Carter. He was an NCAA star in the late 80s, known for his speed and his powerful, accurate shots. He had a 10-year professional career. In 1990, he was actually the second leading scorer in RPI history. All that is to say, John Carter was very successful and well known. Joanne was studying to become an eye doctor at the time, and so the two never got married, but they did end up having a daughter together. She was born on February 20th, 1991, and they named her Alyssa Ann. However, John was never involved in Alyssa's life. I'm not sure if this was his or Joanne's choice, but as a result, Alyssa took Joanne's last name, Presti, and she raised her on her own. Joanne didn't even keep in touch with John, just to correspond in regard to their court-ordered child support, and that's it. But sadly, in 1993, John suffered a career-ending injury to one of his eyes. He needed intense ocular surgery, I'm talking 8 surgeries, and unfortunately, the trauma caused way too much damage to his eye. As a result, he had to have his eye removed in 1996, leading to his retirement. Life definitely ended up changing for John after this, and we will get into more of that later. It's important for me to go back to what was going on in Joanne's life. Not too long after Alyssa was born, Joanne met a guy named Frank Martinu, and they began a romantic relationship together. This time, it led to her very first marriage. Then around 1993, they had a little boy that they named Justin. Frank was a great dad, he loved Justin so much. The only problem was he and Joanne totally clashed. They did not see eye to eye on things, and therefore their marriage ended up in divorce. By 2002, Joanne was divorced for a second time, and this was very soon after getting married. This time, the relationship went well beyond not seeing eye to eye. It had become physical. Joanne was married to a man named Thomas Pollock, and she ended up getting pregnant. I don't know if Thomas was very thrilled about this, considering what happened to his ex-wife Cassandra when she was pregnant. It was said that he slammed her head into a sink while she was pregnant, which left her with 2 black eyes. I don't have many details on this, but apparently, according to Joanne, he had put his hands around her neck, hit her with a phone, tied that phone cord around her neck, and then when she tried to call the police, he threatened to blow up her car. He did all of this in front of her daughter Alyssa, and this was all going on while Joanne was pregnant with Thomas's baby. Her friends actually witnessed the bruises on her arms on several occasions. Joanne gave birth to baby Sean Pollock in 2001, and that very same year, she filed a restraining order against Thomas. Their divorce was finalized in 2002. That wasn't the end of their issues, though. Their relationship had been so bad, Joanne didn't even want child support. She just wanted Thomas out of her life for good. Sometimes it's hard when you share a child, so she was terrified that Thomas would harm her. She actually slept on the couch so that she could potentially hear him come through the door in the event he broke in to attack her. I was thinking, that is pretty intense, to alter the way you do things as far as even being comfortable in your own home while sleeping, because you are that fearful, as they say, sleeping with one eye open. Her doors were never unlocked. She double-checked everything all the time just in case. The reason she was so scared was because Thomas would not stop harassing her. He would threaten to find her, beat her up, and then take baby Sean away. So, by 2004, it's safe to say that Joanne hasn't had the easiest life, but her career was going well. She's a hard-working single mom of 3 children, living in a quaint little town in Woburn, Massachusetts. She chose this area since 1, it was close to her parents, who lived about 15 minutes away in a nearby town of Billerica, and 2, and maybe most importantly, It was known as a very family-friendly community. It's the type of town that people will move to and stay there for the rest of their lives. It's a very close-knit community full of hard-working blue-collar residents that pretty much have each other's back. Joanne was adamant about living in a safe neighborhood. She moved to Tobin Drive. It's lined with manicured lawns and look-alike little duplex apartment buildings with several basketball hoops that invite the local kids to play right on the street. There are no through streets here either. At the end of the road, there was a cul-de-sac, which means it's closed off on one side. This one had a home right at the end, and this was a place where kids could ride their bikes, turn around, and go back down the road without worrying about too many cars passing through. That was perfect for Joanne, since she was overly protective of her kids, and rightfully so. She was paranoid definitely after that relationship with Thomas. She never knew what could happen to one of her children. As a matter of fact, everyone that knew Joanne knew that her children were her world. She was a very loving mother. She worked really hard to provide for her children the best way that she knew how. No matter how bad her relationships were with her children's fathers, she never took it out on her children. They were the light of her life. They brought so much joy because family was so important to her, especially growing up in a traditional Italian household. We're talking big family dinners, sitting around the table, sharing anything and everything that's going on in your life, and being protected by the people closest to you no matter what. That loyalty to your own blood is strong, and she passed that on to her own children. Some people thought that she was a little too overprotective. She definitely wouldn't let her kids play outside alone, even in her own front yard. That sounds kind of normal for a lot of parents, but in 2004, her daughter was 12, Justin was 10, and the baby was only 2. I can totally understand that. However, Joanne's friends knew that there was no way she would let her children out of her sight. So instead, she would invite all the neighborhood kids to come to her house to play. And everyone loved that. They loved Joanne. She was the type of mom that would not only watch her kids play in the pool, but she would also jump into the pool and play with them. She was very involved, and there was always something fun happening at the Prestes' home, like slip and slide during the summer, birthday parties, holiday get-togethers, you name it. Now that you know what Joanne was like as a mother, what about how she was as a person, as a friend, as a daughter, and as a sister? Well, Joanne was very extroverted. She loved to laugh, she loved to spend time with her friends and go out and have some drinks, some fun at nightclubs. She enjoyed things like the neighborhood cookout. She was the type of friend that would touch base every day to check in with those that she cared about most. She was known as the Pied Piper of her neighborhood because she was very charismatic, and it would just attract people to her. She also loved those traditional Italian holidays, especially the traditional Italian Christmas. Joanne was also very generous. One time, when she was struggling to make ends meet, she had to resort to moving back in with her parents. However, she heard that her brother Peter had fallen on some really hard times financially after leaving the military and going to college. So she gave up her entire tax refund check and gave it to Peter. That's the kind of person she was. And to top it off, according to her landlord Harinder Mohan Singh and his wife Satnam Singh, who they called Sandy, they thought Joanne was a model tenant. She had just recently upgraded to a bigger apartment, just a few houses down from her previous one in another duplex. This one was located at 13 Topman Drive. It had 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and it was a pretty nice size. It had a kitchen that was perfect for cooking and a nice big backyard for the kids to play in. The Singhs lived on the other side of the structure. It was attached, and they had a really fun time having Joanne and her children as neighbors, especially because they had children of their own. Joanne actually offered to help the Singhs repair her unit because it had just been damaged by the previous tenants, and Joanne got to work right away. She repainted all the walls in each room, and she put up some new blinds in the living area. Joanne and Sandy would watch their kids play together, and the families became really close. They would even spend holidays and some birthdays together, having fun and exchanging gifts. The Singhs actually owned a gas station, and they would give Joanne gift cards so that she could shop there for free. Joanne was passing all of her traits onto her only daughter, Alyssa, and she was already becoming a bright, smart, and talented young lady. Joanne and Alyssa had a very close relationship and a very close bond. They were seen by others as having the perfect mother-daughter relationship. Joanne was attentive, she listened, she spent quality time with Alyssa, and she just doted on her. She adored her so much. In January 2004, Alyssa was in 7th grade. She was attending Daniel L. Joyce Middle School, and she was a Pop Warner cheerleader. She was about to turn 13, and that's pretty exciting. Alyssa was also Annette and Peter's only granddaughter. She was the light of their lives. Annette noticed how mature Alyssa was. She was always helping her mom with her 2 younger brothers, who were actually quite a handful, especially little Sean, who was only 2. She was very responsible for her age, and just like her mom, she was protective over her family. She would watch over the boys when they were both there, because 10-year-old Justin actually spent weekends with his father, who lived about 30 minutes away in a town called Revere. His father was actually in the process of attempting to get full custody of Justin, and it did seem like it was going to lean in his favor. Without knowing all the details, I'm assuming that the court had their reasons. Perhaps they agreed to allow Justin to be with Joanne for a number of years and then switch over to Frank's care. I don't know, because every state has different family law stipulations and custody orders. Alyssa was a straight-A student, and she wanted to become a pediatrician. Maybe that desire came out of caring for her own siblings. But she was extroverted, just like Joanne. She would light up a room with her big smile, and she was always laughing, dancing with her friends. She was also at the age when you begin to have crushes on boys. So it was typical for her and her friends to get together and talk about their crushes, have little sleepovers. But Alyssa wasn't interested in having a boyfriend. She might be a little bit too young, I'm not sure, but she was focused on school. She was just a really good kid. It was New Year's, and everyone was gathered around the TV watching the ball drop and ringing in 2004. The Prestes lives seemed to be bright and full of opportunities, but they didn't know that something tragic was about to unfold. In just a few days' time, their safe, cozy home would be invaded by evil personified. In order to piece together what's about to happen, we have to go back to the spring of 2003. Joanne and the kids were living in their previous apartment that I mentioned, just a few houses down from their new one on the opposite side of the street. Like always, I'm going to get as detailed as possible so that you get to know everyone. In this case, as usual, the kids are having fun playing outside when another single mom named Bobby Jo Miller came by and introduced herself to Joanne. She lived right across the street in 21B Tom and Drive. They began talking, and they realized that they had a lot in common, and soon they became very close friends. Bobby Jo had kids, and most recently, in May of 2002, she gave birth to a little girl who was still an infant at the time. She was the daughter of Bobby Jo and her ex-boyfriend Michael Bizanowicz, that she had broken up with earlier in the year. They had been friends first. They actually met in 1995 when Bobby Jo was working at a convenience store. So they knew each other for a pretty significant amount of time, and then they eventually started to date. So this breakup was hard on her. She wanted it to work, but it just wasn't. And sometimes when you are in that long-term relationship, you kind of grow up together, in a sense. And it's hard to stay for the long haul because you change so much. And just like Joanne, Bobby Jo was a giver. You could maybe even call her a people pleaser, because she did everything for everyone, especially for someone like Michael, who she loved. So while they were together, she helped him with everything, and when they broke up, she was still helping him with all of his bills, helping him balance his checkbook. She even registered his truck for him in her name. However, sometimes that can be emasculating, and who knows exactly what happened. But eventually they broke up. Michael moved to another town, which was like 20 minutes away, called Lowell, and the women both were on their own, and they would bond over sharing their stories and venting about what a hassle it was sometimes dealing with their exes. The two best friends and their kids were together almost every day from here on out, and they were pretty good support systems for one another. They would watch each other's children, which was a big step for Joanne because we know she is protective. It is nice to have a friend that's literally steps away from your house right across the street. But that changed just slightly in November of 2003 when Joanne decided to move, like I said, a couple houses down to 13 Topman Drive. It didn't change that much. They still lived on the same road, and they continued being there for one another. They would give advice, and they just really wanted the best for each other. Bobby Jo had even softened her heart a little bit, and she began to allow her daughter to have visitation with Michael. The women were just a really good influence on one another. Joanne would even tell the children that they should always respect and listen to their parents, even if they were divorced. So if Michael came by to spend time with Bobby Jo and the baby, everyone should be kind, and Joanne really didn't get involved in all that. But she was always cordial anytime Michael came around, even though Bobby Jo would still argue with him right in front of everyone. Michael seemed to be doing his best. He even helped install some new cabinets in Joanne's apartment when she moved in. So as a thank you, she invited him and Bobby Jo over with the kids one night. And on that night, he agrees to help Joanne hook up her cable TV. He worked for Bobby Jo's mom, Linda's boyfriend, at his shop as an apprentice electrician. And since Linda had known Michael a long time, she did this kind of out of the kindness of her own heart to help him pay the child support that he owed her own daughter. So Michael definitely wanted to stay employed, and he needed the practice. But sadly, those good vibes went completely bad when Michael didn't bring over the right cables, and Bobby Jo kind of blew up on him and yelled at him in front of everyone, and then she stormed right out of the house. So Michael, he follows right behind her like a little puppy dog trying to catch up to her and make things right. And I couldn't help but think, was Bobby Jo maybe just a little bit jealous that Michael took an interest in helping Joanne? There's another couple that I introduced you to, and that is the Singhs. Remember them? These are Joanne's landlords. It was the landlord and his wife. I did tell you that they were very close, but perhaps Joanne and Mr. Singh were a little bit more than landlord and tenants in that kind of relationship. Harinder was someone that came and went as he pleased because he owned the building. He would always be there to promptly fix anything that Joanne needed repaired, and they got along really well. Joanne had that charismatic personality. She made friends with everyone, and perhaps sometimes men might think that she wants more. And there were rumors that were already going around among her friends that the seemingly happy married man had a romantic interest in Joanne. Most of these rumors swirled when they found out that Joanne would go over Harinder's basement for drinks when Sandy went to bed. So his wife's in bed, and he is in his basement inviting another woman over to have drinks. I don't know. Maybe Sandy didn't like drinking. There's nothing wrong with having a drink with a friend, right? But I don't know. Harinder would bring a bottle of Koenig down, and they would just chit-chat from time to time. Joanne really did have a lot to talk about, and sometimes we just need to vent to someone that's not directly involved in our lives, kind of like at arm's length. And one thing Joanne was facing at the time was one of her children's fathers in court. We all know it's not Thomas. She said good riddance to him and feared for her life, but it's actually the former hockey player star ex-boyfriend, John Carter. She tried to stay out of his life and his business, but he decided to stop paying his child support. Everything had been going well for the last 12 years in regard to his daughter Alyssa, but after his career ended up struggling, he started to drink a lot. He was supposedly an alcoholic, and he fell into some tough times. At this point, one of John's business deals fell through, and he had spent all the money that he had left over from his celebrity hockey days. But as for the relationship between Joanne and her landlord, the word travels fast in a small neighborhood like theirs, and when everything unfolds, I think you may question whether or not Sandy knew about this little friendship between them. As a matter of fact, all the neighbors pretty much knew each other's routines. They knew everyone's comings and goings. The The minute Joanne would wake up in the morning, she would open up those blinds that she had installed herself and let the sunlight in, and neighbors knew this. They would even see her and wave as they walked by. Jumping back to the new year, it was Saturday, January 3rd. Joanne asked Bobby Joe's sister to go to a local bar in Lynn, which is about 35 minutes away. And this area looks really cool and has some really cool clubs and a fun nightlife that's perfect for a girls' night out. Bobby Joe had to be up early in the morning to prepare for Michael to come pick the baby up, so she offered to stay back and watch the kids. Now Justin, Joanne's 10-year-old, he was at his dad's that weekend, so it was just Alyssa and Sean. They ended up sleeping over that night, and the next morning, on January 4th, Joanne picked the kids up around 10 or 11 a.m. Later that night, around 7:30 p.m., Joanne stops by Bobby Joe's to hang out for a bit. However, Bobby Joe notices that Joanne's not acting like herself. She looked sad, as though she had been crying. So Bobby Joe asked her what's wrong, and she said, "You know what? I'm just tired. I had a long night last night. I have a really bad headache." And therefore, Joanne only stayed around 15 minutes and then went home. She wanted to get some rest, since she and Bobby Joe planned to go shopping the next day and return some of their Christmas gifts. Other than Joanne looking a bit tired, nothing was out of the ordinary as far as Bobby Joe was concerned. That is, until the next morning. She wakes up around 8 o'clock, and then she calls Joanne to check on their shopping plans, but Joanne doesn't answer. So she leaves a message, then she calls back a few more times, and there's still no answer. So she left a few more messages, assuming Joanne had just slept in due to her being so tired from the night out. Later, Bobby Joe drives past Joanne's place, and that's when she does notice that something is different. Joanne's blinds were not open, and by this time of the day, her blinds were always open, especially because Joanne smoked cigarettes, so she would open the windows to let the smoke out and let the fresh air in. So Bobby Joe couldn't help but wonder what was going on with Joanne. But she had her own priorities to deal with, and she just figured Joanne was busy as usual and had forgotten about their plans. However, over the next couple of days, January 6th and 7th, Bobby Joe started to become concerned. She had still not heard from Joanne, and that was out of character for her. She drove past her house again. The blinds were still not open. And Joanne's minivan, it was like kind of collecting, because it was winter time, it was kind of like collecting like an icicle on it. It had not moved from that position the entire time. And that was really odd, because if Joanne was home, those blinds would be open. So something wasn't right. And at this point, she thinks that maybe Joanne is ignoring her on purpose for some reason. A lot of times we make excuses because we really don't want to assume the worst, that something more sinister could be going on. But she was concerned enough to go to the door and knock. No one answered. That afternoon, on January 7th, Bobby Joe was so worried about Joanne that she reached out to Joanne's mom, and she informs her that she hasn't heard from her for a few days now, and she adds all those peculiar things that she saw at Joanne's home. Annette knew her daughter. She knew about the blinds and thought she would not be leaving those down into the afternoon. That was just way out of the ordinary, was not normal. So she starts getting worried. She's imagining that something horrible might have happened. So she calls out to her husband Peter that they needed to leave right then and there to check on Joanne and the children. They jump in the car and they make that 9-mile drive, but Annette had this sickening feeling in her gut. Maybe it's mother's intuition, but it seemed like an eternity before they actually pulled into Joanne's driveway, and this was around 4 p.m. They had no clue just how horrified they would be when they find out what is waiting for them inside. The entrance of Joanne's unit is on the side of the house right here. The door was unlocked. They walk inside, and the door opens right into this kitchen area. They don't see anything there, so they proceed into the living room, where Joanne routinely sleeps on the couch, which is what it probably looked like to Annette as she first glanced in that direction. As she's scanning the room, she saw Joanne face down on the couch as though she was asleep. But that would not make sense at 4 p.m. So as she gets closer, that's when she saw it. That's when she knew that Joanne wasn't sleeping. Annette saw a pool of blood beneath Joanne's head. So she screams for her husband. She said, "You have to touch her. She might still be alive." And I cannot even fathom stumbling upon the scene. Your daughter, your only daughter, the one that you raised for 34 years of their life, is lying lifeless in front of you, and there isn't nothing that you can do. It's your job as a parent to protect your children and your grandchildren. They become a part of you. They're a huge part of your life. And now there was nothing to do but to panic and to call the police. The next thing Peter and Annette want to do is locate the children. Where are the children? They begin to leave the lower level and search upstairs where the bedrooms are. Meanwhile, police and medical are on their way. So Peter gets upstairs before Annette. The door to the baby's room is shut, and when he opens it and runs in, he sees baby Sean in his crib. He is crying. And when he picks him up, he could tell he's dehydrated, and his diaper, it was heavy with what seems like days of feces and urine inside. But he's alive. He's unharmed. Annette's downstairs, but on her way up. And Peter had picked up Sean, and he rushed into the very next room, which was Alyssa's room. And what he witnessed will probably never be erased from his mind. It was a sight he definitely did not want his wife to see. And she was screaming up to him that she wanted to see Alyssa. And he screams back down that there's no way because she's dead. He would not let his wife go up there. So he came downstairs as Annette was in complete shock. It's a snowy winter evening. The first responders come up to 13 Topman Drive, and they were there within minutes of receiving that call. Annette is holding Sean, and when the paramedics arrive, things are happening so fast. She hands the baby to them, and then they ask if she's okay, and she doesn't even know what to say. And not knowing what was inside, they didn't know if maybe she was hurt, and that can't even speak. She doesn't know how to respond to them, but she just turns to the paramedic and she mutters, "Please just hold my hand." And that is exactly what the paramedic did. Then they take Sean and they rush him to the hospital for treatment, and Annette follows close behind to be by his side. Now I'm about to get to the part of the case where we will get the very first set of clues that will lead to what could have happened. This is when I can't help but put myself into these investigators' shoes. They proceed into Joanne's apartment. They notice that the side door is unlocked and there are no signs of forced entry. All the windows are closed and they're also locked. So they make their way through the kitchen, taking notes regarding the way everything appeared. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, regular kitchen. It looked lived in. There were dishes in the sink, there were some tools on the floor, a full and tied up garbage bag on the floor that looked like somebody had been in the middle of doing a project or some light cleaning. And before they could finish it, something occurred that took them away from their work. The kitchen table was fairly tidy. They see a baby's booster chair in one of the seats, and they don't notice any obvious signs of struggle. No blood, nothing. But as they walk into the living room area, they see a love seat, children's toys scattered, and the couch where Joanne's parents found her lying face down. Detectives finally see just how horrific this scene really was. Joanne wasn't just lying on the couch in like a normal position. She wasn't. The left side of her upper body was hanging slightly off of the side of the couch, and her head was on one side and her feet were on the other. So she was laying across the couch. Her head was also kind of dangling off one side, and it was hanging above a pool of blood on the carpet. The couch cushions that were underneath her, near her upper body, were saturated with blood. Joanne's hands and feet were tied behind her back with rope, as well as duct tape, and she was only clothed from her waist up. Her bottoms and her panties were found on the floor, and the panties were rolled up, the way it looks if someone takes them off in a hurry. And this indicated that there was some kind of struggle, and that was confirmed when they found a rolled-up towel near where her head was. This was identified as being used as a gag so that she couldn't scream. When they turn her body over, that's when they see what they believe was her cause of death. She had multiple knife wounds to her neck. Everything they observed so far leads them to believe that Joanne had been bound and gagged so she could not put up a fight, and then she was forced into intercourse. Finally, she was stabbed and left for dead. Was the sole reason intercourse? That was one of the questions they don't know, but every clue matters when you're piecing everything together. They have a lot more to analyze downstairs, but they move on to the second floor. The crime scene investigators moved into an upstairs bedroom. It belonged to Alyssa, and they saw a desk with papers on it and a chair that looked as though it was scooted out. You know, how somebody would have to stand up in the middle of their work. And this was because there were, pens, pencils, things that looked like she was using them, and a couple of drawers open. There was also a dresser with some open drawers as well, and it looked cluttered. It looked like a normal teenager's room, the way they would keep it. There's a lava lamp, there was a TV, and there were other miscellaneous young girls' items. However, the room was a mess in a way that proved there was probably a very intense struggle that went on. And I'm talking complete disarray. You could tell that the bed had been moved. It used to be against the wall, and it wasn't in its original location. And there were pillows and blankets all over the floor. Even the bed sheets had been pulled off and like rolled into a ball. One of the saddest things for me was to see all of Alyssa's items on the dresser, the things that she used every day, the things that she collected and loved. They were all standing still in time, just like Alyssa, because to the investigators' shock and terror, they see the young girl lying face down on her bedroom floor between the bed and the dresser, and there is a massive amount of blood underneath her. When they examined her closely, they realized that her throat was slit from ear to ear, and there were smears and spatters that were located all over the bedroom, all over the mattress, even on the sides of the mattress, smears across the wall. This was a 12-year-old girl who did this. And why did they do this? It just doesn't seem like this can be real. How does something like this even happen? From what I could gather, it seemed as though Alyssa had been chased into the room and that she was trying to get away. She was opening drawers to block the person's path, moving her bed to hide behind it, and she put up quite a fight. But she was no match for the evil monster who did this to her. Both bodies were removed and transported to the coroner's office for complete autopsies, and that is just a waiting game. I will come back to this when they get the results. Meanwhile, there is a lot of work for investigators to do, so they begin looking all around the apartment for clues. They examine the area that Joanne sits in to work on the computer, and there's a pile of money on the desk, and it hasn't even been touched or taken. It was just laying there. There was also money in other places around the house. So they begin to think that the motive was something different. It was something other than burglary. By this time, the rest of Joanne's immediate family had been notified of the tragedy, and they rushed to be by Sean's bedside at the hospital. They were in utter disbelief that this could happen to people that they loved so much. They didn't understand how this could happen right inside Joanne's home. This is a place where her and her children are supposed to feel safe, and there's just one wall between them and another family just like theirs with innocent little children inside. And there are so many questions, and they want answers fast. Bobby Joe was the next person notified that Joanne and Alyssa were dead. She's completely shocked. She had just seen both of them, so how can this be real? And she's completely distraught. She just can't be alone. And she's so scared that she might be next because she was the closest one of Joanne's friends. She just couldn't be by herself. So at that time, she went to go stay at her mother's and then met up with Michael, who arrived immediately to console her and help her with her kids. The same night before they leave, investigators decide to canvass the entire area around Joanne's house. They wanted to see if anyone had seen anything, if they saw someone lurking in the neighborhood. That person might still be there. And not only that, they want to question residents that are close by in case they witnessed anything else that was concerning while it's still fresh in their minds. But to their disappointment, no one seemed to have heard or seen anything. Some of them do mention that they saw Joanne a few days earlier, but nothing after that, which kind of makes sense. Most of the residents were inside. It was cold, it was snowy. This was the winter. They were enjoying dinners and movies in the warmth of their cozy beds. It's just too bad that that night wasn't the same in the Presti household. Investigators believe that this was a crime of passion, that this crime was carried out by someone close to this family, someone that knew Joanne, someone that Joanne must have trusted. We know how protective she was, even sleeping on the couch for this exact reason. She was scared of something that was going to happen, and it did. It's time to start to put together a list of suspects and interview them one by one, starting with anyone that may have had a problem with Joanne. And that list comes together pretty quickly, especially after talking to Joanne's family. And I'm sure you can probably guess some of the people that are on it that they're interested in talking to. Joanne had not had much luck when it came to the men in her life. Also, there's a timeline coming together. They think that they know approximately when the crime was committed. The next day, they call Alyssa's school because they're trying to piece everything together. And it turns out she wasn't in class on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday of that week, which leads the investigators to believe Joanne and Alyssa have been deceased for several days before they were found. They think they might have been murdered sometime between Saturday night on January 4th and Sunday, January 5th. I want you to think back and remember how Bobby Joe didn't hear from her on the morning of January 4th. That was after Joanne left the night before with a headache. They were supposed to go Christmas shopping, and that was on Sunday. So things are starting to come together, but they're also looking really confusing. How could no one notice this? Not even her next-door neighbor, the landlord with an attached home with thin walls. Nothing, no noises, nothing. This couple spent time over Joanne's, and Joanne's went to, the landlord's basement on a regular basis, and their kids played together. So what is going on? So police want to pay Harinder a visit. He tells police that he didn't hear anything at all. Really? They aren't so sure, but he insists that he and his wife were at home watching TV that night. And since he was a friend of Joanne's and she confided in him, he tells police that one of her children's fathers may have something to do with it. However, police want to know if he had something to do with it. And this was because of his proximity and the fact that they thought it was impossible for him not to hear anything. Was it because he was carrying it out? They get a search warrant for his house and cell phone records. And this is where it gets a little interesting. They find out a few things that turn out to raise some red flags. First of all, they find a roll of duct tape, and it visually matches the duct tape that's found on Joanne's body, so they collect it for forensic testing. Then the phone records come in. Joanne called Harinder at around 10 p.m. on Sunday night, and this call only lasted a few seconds. Why would she be calling him so late at night? Was it for another drink in the basement? They're starting to build out the timeline even more. It seems like their deaths occurred between Sunday night and Monday morning, because as they're getting more information, the timeline is coming together. When they ask Harinder, he says none of that is true. He says she called about a clogged sink in the bathroom and asked when he could come repair it. That late at night, though, at 10-something, she's calling the landlord? I mean, maybe it was an emergency. Harinder could be the last person who talked to Joanne or saw her on Sunday night, so they need to dig in deeper before they can. The autopsy reports come back in. The manner of death for both Joanne and Alyssa is homicide. We could have guessed that. But what about the cause of death? The medical examiner concluded that Joanne had been gagged with a towel, bound with duct tape and rope, and then forced to have intercourse. The cause of her death was the 7 wounds to her neck, one of which had nearly severed her carotid artery. Blunt force trauma to her head was also a contributing factor. DNA was collected from 3 places of the crime scene, 2 of which had been retrieved from Joanne's body, while the third was taken from a shirt that she was wearing at the time of her death. This would be used as a comparison as the suspects are located. Meanwhile, 12-year-old Alyssa sustained trauma to her face and damage to the inside of her lip from her braces. This indicated to police that she had been punched in the face multiple times. Like her mother, she had also died from wounds on the neck, which had severed both of her carotid arteries. DNA was collected from underneath her fingernails. There was no sign of forced intercourse. From what they had gathered, it seemed like Joanne was the real target. The reason being, Alyssa sustained, in their opinion, much less trauma, but a more cut-and-run type of injury, almost as though she got in the way of what the perpetrator was doing, and he just had to quickly take care of her. We will dive deeper into this theory a little later. Right now, the investigators are ready to get back out there and find their killer. They begin a background check, and I'm going to call him Mr. Singh. I don't know if it's Harinder, no. So, Mr. Singh, they want to do a background check, and they also want to interview Joanne's friends as well as some previous tenants about him, so they can find out because things are starting to seem a little bit suspicious. And it turns out his last tenant, she described him as a creep, and she tells police that one night she caught him hiding underneath her porch. Could there be a reason? I thought to myself. Was he fixing something? Was he really just a weirdo hiding under the porch? Then Joanne's friends reveal their little rendezvous in the basement together. Investigators search, and they find 2 glasses, which they collect for DNA. Then they get a break in the case, a connection, phone records, and reports from friends that show that Mr. Singh wasn't just providing a place for Joanne to live, he was also providing for her financially. Not fully, just here and there. He was giving her money, and he helped furnish her home. Sometimes landlords do that, I don't know. Sometimes you rent a furnished home. But the investigators want to confront him. He denies any romantic involvement whatsoever. He tells them, you know what? I cared about her and her children. I'm her friend. And he knew that she didn't have a father figure for her kids. He didn't want them to be without things, especially with Joanne losing the child support from John recently. And it was that simple. He was the kind of man that just wanted to help out his tenant. However, he checks off many of the things on their list. He had access to her apartment. He was someone she trusted. She would have let him in, no questions asked. And perhaps there was more going on between him and her. And maybe he needed to stop Joanne from telling his wife. That seems a little far-fetched, but stranger things have happened, and ones that make less sense for sure. So Mr. Singh was their very first real suspect, and he willingly gives police's DNA. And now they wait while all the evidence is being collected and tested. And next on their list was her ex-husband, Thomas, because friends believe he could be responsible. Remember him, the one that harmed both his ex-wife and Joanne while they were pregnant? It sounds like he's a monster to me, and the investigators felt the same way. The fact that Thomas's 2-year-old son Sean was unharmed leads them to have a theory that he may have done exactly what Joanne feared, that he came to get revenge. They track him down, but he's all the way in Delaware. He's a caretaker for the estate of the wealthy DuPont family. So he's informed about what happened to Joanne and Alyssa. At first, he seems pretty indifferent. He denies that he has anything to do with this crime. He also denies ever laying his hand on Joanne in the past. In regard to the night in question, he insisted that he had an alibi. He wasn't anywhere near that area. He says that he has a receipt from a store in Delaware from early Monday morning. Plus, someone did see him that Sunday night. It would have been impossible for him to cross over state lines and get back to Massachusetts to just carry out this crime. He told them, you know what, maybe I'm not the greatest boyfriend or husband, but I am certainly not a killer. Then he added that even though Joanne and him didn't get along, she was the mother of his son, and he would never ever harm her. He would never want his son to be without a mother, period. And then he goes on to say he would have never harmed Alyssa, that she was beautiful, she was sweet, she was kind, and it ripped his heart apart. So he submits his DNA for testing, but these lies, they come easily for men who allegedly harm their wives or women. They like to blame things on others. Nothing is ever their fault. So they take Thomas's interview with a grain of salt until they have the DNA tested. There's 2 down and many more to go. And by this time, the duct tape that was found at Mr. Singh's house was not a match. They go ahead and let him know, but they tell him, we're still waiting for the results of your DNA. And that's when he tells the police the fact that Joanne had just been in court with her ex-boyfriend, John Carter, Alyssa's father. Apparently that was the very first time that he had ever met her, the first time in her whole life. And maybe this triggered him. So investigators get all the same info we already know. It really does seem like John may have the most to gain from both Joanna and Alyssa being out of the picture. He definitely wouldn't have $25,000 to worry about, that's for sure. But would he risk prison or death? So they need to dig deeper into his life and track him down as soon as they can. They bring him in, and right away this guy is sweating profusely. He just does not look right. He's distraught, he's completely upset, he seems totally believable. It is true, I mean, he just found out his daughter has been murdered along with her mother, his ex. But he wasn't close to either one of them. So what is he really nervous about? Well, they think they might know. A witness comes forward and gives them information about John. They said he was so close to Joanne's on the night of the crime. John was drinking at a bar only 100 yards from her house. They thought there probably wasn't anyone they would find that was going to be that close as John was to Joanne's that night. So they really think that they have their guy. He's got the motive and the proximity. So they have a theory. He went there to have an alibi. He went drinking so that people would see him, and then he left without anyone noticing. Especially if, by that point in the night, his friends were drunk. This all happened close enough to Joanne's for him to leave the bar, walk to her house without being noticed in the dark, carry out these gruesome acts to take the law into his own hands instead of forking over $25,000. They question him about the court proceedings for the child support, and he tells them that was 8 months ago, and he admitted that him and Alyssa did not have their traditional father-daughter relationship. But from what he knew about her, she seemed like the sweetest girl, and he really did regret that he wasn't a part of her life. They're able to get his DNA, but they don't have anything to hold him on, so they have to let him go. They're hoping that he doesn't skip down. He's their #1 suspect right then, and they tell him, "Don't go anywhere, because we're not done with you yet." The community is full of fear. People aren't even coming out of their homes. Their children aren't riding their bikes or playing basketball in the streets because there could be a killer among them. They want answers. Even the children at Alyssa's school can't sleep at night. One of her friends, Kelly Lyric, said that she looked over at Alyssa's empty seat in class and that she couldn't help but be overcome with sadness. She said that Alyssa was always laughing, that she had such an uppy personality. She was just always there for her, and it was the type of friendship that you never wanted to lose. That loss really shook this tight-knit community. Police were confident that they had their man with everything they found out about John Carter. But they were about to hit a wall, and the entire investigation is going to come to a halt. All 3 DNA samples come back and they're negative. None of the men, not the landlord Thomas or even John, are a match. So who did this? Joanne was a sweet person. Alyssa was a child, an innocent little girl. So investigators want someone to make it make sense. They thought that whoever did this was someone with rage, just this rage inside of them that made investigators think that this was probably a lover. So they started to wonder whether Joanne had a boyfriend that no one knew about. Or maybe she met someone when they went out on Friday night to that bar with Bobby Joe's sister. Bobby Joe did say that Joanne looked like she had been crying the last night she saw her. So why could it have been something to do with her 10-year-old son, Justin, and the custody battle between her and his father, Frank? It's kind of convenient that Justin, he's not in the house when all these horrific things happened to his mom and his half-sibling. Wouldn't it be easy if Joanne was just out of the picture and Justin was free to live with Frank without ever having to deal with another conflict with his mother? Maybe she wanted Justin to come home on Sunday night, but Frank refused to bring him, and then maybe she threw a fit, causing Frank to become triggered. These are all just theories that they had, and then Frank was informed of what happened to Joanne and Alyssa, and his entire family was in shock. Frank was completely cooperative, but he also retains an attorney who speaks on his behalf going forward. During this case, Frank submits his DNA, and it ends up not being a match. After this, his attorney tells the media that the Martin News want their privacy. They're in shock, and they're focusing all their attention on Joanne and Frank's surviving son, Justin, because it's traumatizing. This family now has to pick up the pieces and care for a little boy who wasn't home, and he comes back to find out he doesn't have a family, like a portion of his family is erased. The trauma that he has to deal with, that's a lot. The PTSD, that's a lot. So rightfully so, this family wants their privacy, and investigators are back at square one. They have no choice but to go back to the crime scene and take an even more in-depth look around the entire house. During this time, the Presti family gets together to say goodbye to Alice and Joanne at San Barbara's church. The family weren't the only ones to pay their respects. There were more than 400 people in attendance, including many of Alyssa's classmates. Joanne's close-knit family stood together. They were hugging each other while they were standing around the two white linen-draped caskets. Following the church service, the funeral and the burial were held at Fox Hill Cemetery, where both Joanne and Alyssa were finally laid to rest. The police chief was a neighbor of Joanne's, and he was at the funeral, and when he was interviewed, he said that the relatives and the mourners and the entire town remained in a complete state of shock. They were plagued by questions more than a week after these slangs that took place, and he said it's a tragic shock to the whole community and their families and their friends, and that the schools and the entire town were in fear. They hadn't had anything like this happen before, and he said that he's had sleepless nights this whole week. He's been wondering how something like this could happen. And this is coming from a police chief who has seen a lot of things in his career. And as you're watching this, you're probably wondering the same thing. Will they ever get to the bottom of this? Well, back at the crime scene, they're gathering even more potential evidence, and their focus is on Presti's computer. And it turns out someone in the household had been chatting online the night of the crime. So now police are wondering whether Alyssa may have been the target of an online predator, but as they dig deeper, they realize it wasn't Alyssa. It was actually Joanne that was doing the chatting with someone very unlikely. A person that definitely raises an eyebrow, and that's because of his age. That's right, she was having a conversation with a 16-year-old boy from the neighborhood, and police think that that's kind of odd. Alyssa? Okay, Joanne? They're questioning it. However, Joanne's friends say that's not weird at all. A lot of times kids from the neighborhood would come to Joanne for advice, especially if their parents weren't around, or they just needed some guidance from someone that's outside of their situations. However, the police still need to rule this boy out. For all they know, something could happen in that conversation, and it could have driven him into a rage. They just don't know, so they have to check out every single lead. So they interview him, and he admits he was talking to Joanne that night. But it was innocent. It was just in regard to Alyssa, and when classes were going to begin after winter break. Police confirm this. They release him and move on. So they are really at a loss. They have no choice but to spread out and go wider. So they look at things from the forced intercourse point of view. They decide to look into offenders that are in the area that had recently been released from prison, that were on parole, or any of them that were on the registry. So they interviewed every single one they could find. Each one of them had to give their DNA, and none of them were linked to the crime. The leads are going nowhere, and at this point, they're examining even the most unlikely items in the Presti's household, one of which is a few undeveloped rolls of film that were found in a desk drawer. They have them all developed. And as they're looking through each picture, they're looking for anyone that stood out, anyone that was in pictures with family that had not been interviewed, or anything that could point them in a new direction. They find photos from a children's birthday party, and they recognize someone, Bobby Joe. There were other individuals in the photos, so they call in Bobby Joe so that she can easily identify each one. They assume she's going to know who they are. Now, if you're thinking of leaving and stopping the video, don't. You have to find out exactly what happens next. Don't fast forward, because this case is all over the place, and pretty shocking to me. So, Bobby Joe is naming every single person as the investigators are making a list, and her boyfriend, Michael, is one of the people in the photos. And of course, just like everyone else, he has to be included and eliminated, and that's tough. You don't want your own boyfriend to be caught up in all this. This happens all the time, especially when people are close to the victims. If you're the boyfriend of a victim, husband of a victim, close to them in any way, you're going to be focused on. Nobody likes it, but they explain, we have to rule him out. So she tells them his name and explains they have a daughter together, and the last time they all hung out with Joanne was on Christmas Day. Oh, they definitely have some questions for Michael, but since they have Bobby Joe there and she can vouch for him, they ask her some preliminary ones. It's hard when everyone's a suspect. It can be very uncomfortable, and so can the questions. Bobby Joe tells them everything we already know about her and Michael, how they met, how long they dated, when their daughter was born, the breakup, her inviting him kind of back into her life to see the baby, and how Michael works for her mom's boyfriend as an apprentice electrician to make ends meet and pay child support. She also says her, him, and Joanne are all friends. The investigators do not think Michael is a viable suspect, but they have to keep asking questions until they can completely clear him. They asked Bobby Joe about his whereabouts that weekend to refresh her memory. Joanne went out with Bobby Joe's sister on Saturday night, January 3rd. The next morning, on the 4th, she came over to retrieve Sean and Alyssa between about 10 and 11 a.m. Bobby Joe says she didn't end up seeing Michael that day. He was planning to come over to see their daughter, but he was busy looking at apartments to move into. She talked to him later that day. That was the same night that Joanne came over to Bobby Joe's around 7:30 p.m., and it looked as though she'd been crying. But Joanne says she's just tired and has a headache before going to bed. That night, Bobby Joe called Michael. This was around 11:30 p.m., and they chatted for a few minutes. So investigators go and confirm that this was accurate. They asked her how he sounded, and she said he sounded like he had been drinking, which wasn't unusual. Now here's where things get interesting. Still no real cause for concern, but the next morning, on Monday the 5th, that's the day that she and Joanne were supposed to go shopping, but she couldn't get a hold of her. Well, that day she got a phone call from her mother's boyfriend, Michael's boss, and he informs her that Michael didn't show up for work that day. Bobby Joe is mad. She is mad over the fact that he skipped out of work. So she calls him, and he doesn't pick up, so she leaves a few messages. Eventually, he does call her back, and he says, yeah, he didn't go into work because he was too hungover from the night before. Bobby Joe, who owns his truck, basically threatens to return it to the dealership if he keeps messing up. It had already happened a few times in the past. And the next thing Bobby Joe recalls is on the evening of January 7th, when she heard a neighbor's child screaming and running towards her. When the child got close enough, that's when Bobby Joe realized what they were actually saying, that Joanne and Alyssa were dead. And that is how she found out that her best friend was murdered. So she ran over to Joanne's house, and at that point she's questioned by a couple of officers. She's scared and very emotional. After that, she races over to the hospital to check on Sean's condition. She told detectives that the baby looked tired and weak. That's when she made her way over to her mother's house. When she arrived and her mother heard the news, she immediately calls Michael and tells him to come over quick. He says, "Oh my God, what happened?" That's when Linda told him. He says, "I'm on my way." Detectives start to press Bobby Joe about Michael's demeanor that night. She said that he seemed kind of quiet. He was just sitting there trying to console her, but most of the time, he was just staring at her, and he looked stressed. They asked her if she noticed anything out of the ordinary regarding his physical appearance, and she says that she remembered seeing what looked like hives on his forehead. He let her know they were caused by stress, and he had a lot on his mind. I mean, who doesn't? But Bobby Joe didn't know what it could be. However, detectives are also questioning Linda, Bobby Joe's mother, at this point. After hearing that she had also seen him that night, Linda says she saw cuts and abrasions on Michael's hands and knuckles. Yeah, of course he worked with his hands a lot, but at his job he wore gloves, so this was very significant. And they had heard enough at this point. They include Michael in their list of suspects, and now they needed to dig into his past, do a background check, and find out exactly who Michael Bizanowicz is. While they're interviewing Bobby Joe, they show the photo of Michael to officers, asking if anyone had already interviewed him or cleared him. One of the officers looks over, and he recognizes Michael. He says, "I've arrested him in the past," but he couldn't quite remember the details. However, he said if his memory served him right, it was a crime that was sexual in nature. So now they are really focusing on him. They decide to pay Michael a little visit unannounced so they can get his rendition of that weekend. He agrees to speak to police at his home, but he doesn't want to come down to the station. He says he doesn't even know Joanne that well, that she's just a friend of Bobby Joe's, which, is true. He says they've only hung out a handful of times. As they spoke to him, they were watching his demeanor, his body language, and looking at his hands, and sure enough, they have cuts on them, a telltale sign that he had been in some kind of physical altercation. Could this have been as a result of Alyssa scratching him? This is the closest that they had gotten to possibly being in front of the person who did this to Joanne and Alyssa, so they have to keep him talking. When they ask him about the cuts, he says he sustained them while working, but they already know from Bobby Joe's mom that he wore gloves while he was on the job. Now they wanted his alibi, he says, and this is like the worst alibi ever. For every time I hear a case and they say this, I'm like, worst alibi. He was home by himself all the way back in Lowell, and then most of the night consisted of him on the phone arguing with Bobby Joe. They know that Bobby Joe did speak to him, but she failed to mention any arguments. But there's also an issue. The phone call was before midnight. They know Joanne was on the phone with Mr. Singh at 10 p.m., so there would have been enough time and a matching timeline if Michael would have gotten to Joanne's after speaking with Bobby Joe. But why would he? What connection do Joanne and Michael have besides both being close to Bobby Joe? Michael also tried to pull a fast one on the detectives by claiming that he didn't own a vehicle. And it's true, his truck isn't in his name, but he has possession of it. So why lie? Because this made it look like he had no means to get around, like there was no way he could get to Joanne's, and that simply wasn't true. So they get a warrant for the truck, and they obtain a DNA sample from him. Sure enough, they find rope and duct tape in the truck, and they send it in to be compared to what they found at Joanne's. And while they wait, they decide they need to ask Bobby Joe a few follow-up questions. They confront her about the argument. She admits, yeah, they had been arguing for weeks if not longer. They had been in somewhat of a back-and-forth relationship. They asked her if there would be any reason for Michael to have anything against Joanne. The only thing that Bobby Joe mentions is that her and Michael seemed to argue a lot more once Joanne came into the picture, but it was because Michael felt like Joanne was coming between them, maybe as though he was like the third wheel. So detectives begin to think Michael may have blamed Joanne for the breakup with Bobby Joe, or that it swayed Bobby Joe into not getting back with him. They asked if she was on the phone all night with Michael, since Michael said that he couldn't go in the next morning for work on account of staying up late arguing with her, and that is not true. The phone records confirm he's lying. There's a bigger bombshell that's about to be revealed. Remember that cop that recognized Michael? He jogs his memory and realizes Michael is a level 3 predator. And I think you know what that means. When I say predator, detectives need to confirm this. If this is true, it means that at this level, Michael would have had to do the worst of the worst if offending alone isn't enough. And after running his name, it turns out that it's true. That is gross. This monster among these innocent children on Totman Drive was convicted of 8 counts of forced intercourse with underage individuals, i.e. children, as well as deviant sexual acts in the past. When someone is classified as a level 3 offender, this means that they're most likely going to reoffend. So why do they let a person like him out of prison? But wait, they checked the registry already and they didn't find him, and that's because his residence was registered as being located in Lowell. However, he practically lived with Bobby Joe. And you've got to wait, because this changes everything. Not just in this case, but in the entire state of Massachusetts. It all makes perfect sense to detectives. This man is motivated by sex and deviance. He doesn't need a reason to harm anyone, he just does it. But they know they need to find out exactly what happened and need to be 100% certain that they have the right person. It turns out, not only did the rope and the duct tape match the ones on Joanne's body, but his DNA matched the samples taken from underneath Alyssa's fingernails and from Joanne's body. The team of police and detectives are overcome with emotion. It's a mixture of happiness and excitement that they caught their killer, but it doesn't bring back these two amazing people that lost their lives. Plus, they want to know the answer to the biggest question of all: why? Maybe a note they found in his apartment when they completed their search would give them clues. It was a note written by Michael. It was addressed to his daughter Angela. It said, "You will hear bad things that Daddy did, but Daddy would never harm or hurt a child," and it was signed just Daddy. The date on the top was January 5th, 2004. This means that it would have been written right after he committed the crime. Michael was arrested on January 16th, 2004. Even though they had so much evidence against him, he has always maintained his innocence. But detectives have been doing this long enough to have a pretty solid theory on what happened that fateful winter night. They believe that for months, Michael began building resentment towards Joanne, thinking that she was taking Bobby Joe away from him, that she was the reason the relationship was going downhill. Perhaps, as I mentioned before, these types of people love to blame things on others, even the reason for taking their lives sometimes. So this would be Joanne's fault, right? Detectives believe that as things progressively went downhill for Michael, he began drinking more and more. The night of the crime, after drinking excessively and arguing with Bobby Joe, he knew he wasn't going to get sex from her. So instead, he drove to Joanne's. He wanted to take out his aggression and also take advantage of a woman. When he knocks on the door, she most likely opened it because she knew him. She may not have let him in. He probably pushed his way inside, and he either tried to get her to willingly sleep with him, or he knew from the start what he was going to do because he had rope and duct tape with him. And it's highly unlikely that he came into her house and then went back out to his truck to retrieve it. Whether or not he planned to take her life, we will never know. However, he gagged her with a towel, bound her, and had his way with her, then used the knife, leaving 7 wounds on her neck. All the while, baby Sean and 12-year-old Alyssa were in their rooms. They don't think Alyssa was part of this. They think that she heard what was happening and came downstairs, and at that point, Michael realized there's a witness, and he doesn't want to go back to jail. So he rushes up there to take care of Alyssa, but she puts up an unexpected fight for her life. Unfortunately, Michael won. They think the brutal act was one out of quickness, one swift slice to her throat, and then he just closed the door to Sean's room and left. Maybe this is why he says in his letter to his daughter that he would not harm a child. Maybe he didn't consider Alyssa a child, but was referring to baby Sean. He's a monster, all for his own desires and urges, and I want to briefly let you know 2 more things: what happened in court, and how the laws in Massachusetts were changed because of this. Michael's trial was held at the Middlesex Superior Court. It began on February 27, 2007, more than 3 years after Joanne and Alyssa were discovered. The defense's main argument was that the police failed to thoroughly look into Joanne's landlord, Mr. Singh. Before beginning the trial, the defense went ahead and filed a motion to exclude all the DNA evidence from the proceedings. It's kind of a bold move. Attorney Stanley Norkunis said he didn't deny that Michael's genetic sample matched. However, he argued that the samples were unreliable because their age couldn't be determined. But he claimed that meant the murder charges against Michael should be dismissed. Because the prosecution's case against Michael was being held on by a string, mainly just on the semen samples. I think that's some pretty good evidence, but he argued that the prosecution was relying on what they called misstatements made by Michael to the police when they questioned him about his sexual relationship with Joanne. His lawyer said presidents have made mistakes about sex. That doesn't mean it leads to something criminal. So essentially, what he's saying, in my point of view, was that Michael was actually having a sexual relationship with Joanne this whole time, and that he didn't harm her, that it was the landlord. But Michael's the offender, so that doesn't make sense. Luckily, the judge rejected this motion. The judge was unconvinced that the DNA samples from the crime should be considered circumstantial. No, they were critical. They were significant. Then Michael's attorney questioned Singh about his failure to act on the unusual circumstances. What they meant by this was that he hadn't checked on her. This was your neighbor and tenant, and her shades were drawn on her windows. There seemed to be no activity coming from her apartment. So what was your reason for not checking? Mr. Singh said that it was out of respect, and he said that he had problems of his own going on. I don't know, seems plausible. When the defense was cross-examining his wife, Sandy, they brought up the incident that I mentioned with the previous tenant. The facts of that situation were that on August 17, 2003, her husband, Mr. Singh, had used a spare key to enter the apartment after midnight. Sandy refused to answer this question because she thought it had nothing to do with the prestige, but the judge said, "Yeah, good answer." Sandy says he did not go into that apartment. The tenant was making so much noise fighting with her boyfriend. I don't know how that amounts to anything, but she says he never went inside. Now the defense attorney wants to question Mr. Singh because he's opened this up, right? And the judge said, no, you can't do that. These questions are off limits. I only have a few more things to say because I think they're interesting. But the defense tried their best to paint Michael, believe it or not, as the victim. A victim of an incomplete and rushed investigation. But this didn't work. On March 22, 2007, following a 17-day trial, Michael was found guilty of his charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In their victim impact statements, which I think are very important, Joanne's family did not hold back their hatred for Michael. Her mother, Annette, called him evil personified, which is why I use those same words in this story. She pointed out that he had stabbed her daughter not once, but 7 times. Her cousin Marie said that Michael had bound and gagged Joanne to strip her of her dignity, and this cousin had to cut her honeymoon short because she was notified about the murders. And she told the court that she could only imagine Joanne's horror when she realized that her children were upstairs and she was powerless to help them. These same thoughts were shared by Joanne's father, Peter. He described Michael as a disgrace to the human race, and he said, "When God finally calls you, I hope you rot in hell." Joanne's brother Peter also delivered a victim impact statement. He mentioned, and this was so sad, he mentioned that him and his wife had adopted Sean, who was 5 years old by then. He shared with everyone in the courtroom that the little boy would often draw a 2-story house with scribbles on the stairs, which he said were noise. Peter told the court, "This gets me so emotional. I constantly wonder if the noise he heard is his sister being chased up the stairs and murdered, and they will never know how much Sean heard and saw, but they hope with love that he will recover." Mark, Joanne's other brother, delivered what was perhaps the harshest victim impact statement of them all. He encouraged Michael to finish what he had started when he allegedly wrote that note on the day of the murder. He told him, "Rid us of your evil and take your own life." In 2010, Attorney General Martha Coakley filed a bill, and this was to include an addendum to the Victim Compensation Fund. And I want you to know what this is because I found it very interesting and I did not know about this. So when a crime like this happens, there's usually things left behind, and what I'm talking about is this. They want a fund to spare friends and family members from having to relive their trauma when the Prestige returned to the duplex to collect all of Joanne's things. The crime scene investigators covered the place with fingerprint dust because there was blood in the sink. They tore the entire kitchen apart. They punched holes in the walls looking for a weapon that they never found. But the worst part is that one of her sons called to say, "Mom, the couch is still here with Joanne's blood all over it." Nobody took it away. It's bad enough that they had to go there and go through all of it the first time. But then hearing the pain in her son's voice as he came across basically the same scene, having to see that, is just too much. With this bill, the Attorney General hoped that no one else would have to experience that trauma that Annette and her family went through in the days following the horrific murders. Remember I said something else came out of this case? Something about the state law. Massachusetts changed its offender registry to better classify and track offenders, particularly the most dangerous ones. For instance, one of the amendments was that the offenders now had to have secondary addresses listed. If it's up to them to read, I don't know how does this work. If they're providing the addresses, can't they just lie? This was in direct response to this case. Michael was a level 3 offender. He hadn't been required to register in the city that he was living in with Bobby Joe, only in the one where like his mail went, etc. In January 2011, Michael filed an appeal. Of course he did, with the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. And his claim was that authorities had failed to thoroughly investigate the landlord. He argued that they should have looked into him more. Basically, his attorney said, Mr. Singh had this inappropriate relationship and that was the motive. 3 months later, in April 2011, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts dismissed Michael's appeal, and rightfully so, and they upheld his conviction. They went on to say they found no significant links anyway between Mr. Singh and anything that happened to Joanne. Michael remains imprisoned to this day, and he will remain there for the rest of his life. This case was intense, and I thank you so very much for hearing about Joanne and Alyssa. There are monsters walking among us every single day, so please be safe. Do background checks on everyone that comes into your life, especially if you have children. This doesn't mean that you're paranoid or invading someone's privacy. It means that you are diligent to protect yourself and others. The holiday season is often seen as a time for joy, a moment when loved ones come together to celebrate. It's about the spirit of giving and sharing special moments with those who matter most. Yet for many, it's also synonymous with shopping, particularly on Black Friday. During this frenzied time, everyone is hunting for the best bargain, and if you've ever worked in retail, you know the chaos that ensues. Of course, you've likely heard about the stampedes in stores where people scramble and trample over one another just to snag a deal on something as ordinary as a TV. What you don't often hear, however, is a story about murder. Today's tale is one of greed, manipulation, and the darkness that can overshadow the holiday season, transforming what should be a time of joy into one of fear and tragedy. Today I'm going to be introducing you to Ashlea Ann Harris. She was born in Fort Worth, Texas on November 2nd, 1983. She was the youngest of 3 girls, born to Monica Cassidy and Thomas Harris. Her sisters were Carrie and Melissa, and for most people, it might be hard to stand out in a family of 3 girls, but Ashlea never had any trouble right from the beginning. Her oldest sister, Melissa, knew there was something different about her. Melissa was 10 years old when Ashlea was born, so she remembers everything about her younger sister. She recalls how she used to pretend Ashlea was her baby when they were younger, creating a special bond between them. In her childhood years, Ashlea was described as being sort of a rough-and-tumble kind of kid. She paved her own path in life and didn't care much for painting her nails or playing with Barbie dolls. Unlike her sisters, she liked sports, music, and art. Despite not having too many shared interests, the trio still cared deeply for one another and spent a lot of time together. Ashlea also had a special bond with her mother Monica, and Ashlea would go to bingo all the time, just the 2 of them. It's where they really got to know each other and grow closer. They would spend hours playing the game, laughing, and creating lasting memories. At some point during her childhood, Ashlea's parents divorced, and her mother, Monica, remarried to a man named Chuck. It was tough with all the changes happening, but Ashlea and her sisters persevered and went on with their regular routines. The Harris family eventually found their way toward creating an even bigger, loving, blended family. Both Monica and Tommy remarried, bringing new partners into their lives and the lives of their children. Actually, over time, Ashlea developed a very close relationship with her stepdad, Chuck, and he became a very important figure in her life. She grew into a smart and kind teenager. Ashlea was described as the kind of person who loved everyone and had a natural zest for life. She had plenty of friends and even a few boyfriends in high school. She was one of those people that never had trouble making friends and meeting new people. She was never alone, constantly surrounding herself with people she cared about and that cared about her. Both her stepfather, Chuck, and her father, Thomas, were both law enforcement officers, and everyone thought that Ashlea would follow in their footsteps. She did express some interest, but at the end of the day after graduating high school, she began working at Blockbuster Video in the meanwhile until she figured out what she wanted to do. It was there where she met a customer named Laura Love. Laura was a few years older than Ashley, and over the course of the 8 months, the two of them got to know one another and became the best of friends. Now Ashley was the type of person who attracted both males and females, and she always considered herself straight in high school. She had boyfriends. However, everything changed when she met Laura. Their friendship blossomed into something more, and during this time, Ashley began to question her own sexuality. She found herself drawn to Laura in a way that she had never experienced before. The more time they spent together, the stronger their connection became, and sooner or later, Ashley couldn't deny the feelings that were developing towards Laura. So, after much contemplation and soul-searching, Ashley came to the realization that she had fallen in love with Laura, and Laura shared those same feelings. It was a revelation that excited but also frightened Ashley, because it meant challenging the identity that she had held onto for so long. As she began to explore her identity and become comfortable with it, she came to believe that she had truly found a community where she felt comfortable. It wasn't that she was necessarily uncomfortable in her other friendship circles, but it was like a puzzle piece just clicked into place, and she finally had a full picture of who she was. Despite her initial uneasy feelings and confusion, Ashley couldn't deny the deep emotional bond that she shared with Laura, and with time, Ashley and Laura decided to take their relationship to the next level. This meant Ashley would reveal her secret. She would fully commit to Laura and let the world know. When it came time to tell her loved ones, it didn't exactly go smoothly. Many of Ashley's friends were accepting and told her it made no difference who she was with. They were going to love Ashley no matter what. But when Ashley told her mother, it was a different story. Ashley got the courage to reveal her true self to her mom, Monica, and her stepdad, Chuck, in 2004. With honesty and vulnerability, she shared that she was identifying as a lesbian and that she had a girlfriend. In response, Monica expressed that, deep down in her heart, she always knew this about her daughter. But Monica admitted that she needed time to fully accept and understand this new aspect of Ashley's life. Naturally, Ashley was hurt, but she agreed to give her mom some time. Monica, being deeply religious, was struggling to reconcile the love she had for her daughter with the teachings that she knew from the Bible. So, Monica prayed, wanting guidance in the situation. Eventually, she came to a conclusion. God had given her Ashley, and he wouldn't have done that if she was meant to just throw away their relationship. He would not have given her a daughter to protect, love, clothe, and feed, and then just take her away. So, Monica decided that she loved her daughter more than anything else, and she couldn't imagine a world where they didn't talk anymore. In the end, she and Ashley amended the relationship and resumed going to their bingo nights. Ashley and Laura remained together. Laura's love revealed that Ashley was generous and caring as a girlfriend throughout the 3 years they dated. However, the relationship eventually came to an end due to their divergent aspirations in life. Laura was older, ready to settle down and have kids, while Ashley was having fun, trying to figure out her path in life with no idea where it would take her. However, the two girls still hung out as friends, spending plenty of time in their mutual friend group. Despite parting ways romantically, Ashley and Laura managed to maintain a strong friendship over the years. Laura recalled Ashley's excitement when she received the news of being hired at American Eagle Outfitters in the Hewlin Mall in Fort Worth, Texas, in the fall of 2011. Ashley loved this job. She liked it because she got to meet new people every day, and she took pride in her work. Retail suited her well. Over time, she worked her way up to assistant manager at the Hewlin location. Her boss, Chris Cravey, said that she was one of his favorite employees. Other people who worked at the store had nothing but great things to say about Ashley. One of them even commented that she would go the extra mile for any of the employees on her shift. She didn't just teach them about work, she taught them about life. She was one of the happiest people they knew. I can actually tell from her pictures that she exudes happiness and joy. She's always smiling, and I can tell she's one of those goofy, fun people. And that's exactly the way she was described by friends. One of Ashley's remarkable qualities was her ability to inspire her staff. She had a unique talent for recognizing the potential in others, even if they couldn't see it in themselves. Ashley believed in her employees and encouraged them to strive for greatness. Whether through her words of encouragement or leading by example, she motivated her team to be the best versions of themselves. In addition to her life lessons with her coworkers, Ashley loved to document her everyday life on social media. The topics ranged from what she was wearing that day to whether she was feeling tired or happy. Work was one of her favorite places to be, and it truly showed on camera. She was sort of a vlogger, and back then it was much more rare in the early 2000s. But a few years had gone by, with Ashley dating people on and off, but nothing really stuck. One day in the summer of 2014, she went out to a restaurant with some friends. Ashley had been having a really bad day and wasn't in her usual chipper mood. Their waitress, April Moffat, thought Ashley was so cute and tried to get her to smile, but she didn't have any luck. At the time, April, not knowing Ashley at all, didn't think much of it and proceeded with her shift as usual. But destiny had a path for them. A few weeks later, Ashley recognized April and reconnected through social media. It was like the universe conspired to bring them back together somehow. When Ashley saw April on Instagram, she followed her. The two girls got to talking and decided to meet up and take their dogs on a walk. Ashley's dog, Nala, was her biggest priority, no matter what she had going on in her life. She made sure Nala was taken care of. April brought along her dog, Cooper. April said that she and Ashley had an undeniable connection. She described Ashley as having a magnetic force that made it hard not to love her instantly. After the walk with their dogs, Ashley and April were practically inseparable, and soon they became a couple. By the end of the summer of 2014, Ashley's life was going really well. She found herself content and fulfilled, both in her career and her personal life. She had been contemplating a career shift and was considering joining the loss prevention department at American Eagle Outfitters. This decision was spurred by a robbery at the store. It happened on August 24th at 1 a.m. It was all caught on video. A robber, dressed in all black, went behind the counter and took $188,000 from their safe. The robbery occurred the day after Texas tax-free weekend. Once a year, Texas allows people to purchase certain items tax-free, like shoes, clothing, backpacks, and usually school supplies. This helps lessen the burden for parents during back-to-school shopping. Because of this, tax-free weekend is one of the busiest times of the year for retail stores like American Eagle, and they make more money than usual. That is why the store was hit the next day. Ashley, being influenced by her father's and stepdad's careers in law enforcement, was inspired to look over the surveillance video and work closely with loss prevention to try to identify the perpetrator. She believed she could contribute to the company's safety and security going forward, and she hoped she could work her way up to a position in loss prevention. Meanwhile, there was something else Ashley was trying to work on: her relationship with April. Like most couples, the relationship had its ups and downs. Towards the end of November 2014, the two had decided to take a small break to reevaluate their feelings. The plan was for April to go over to Ashley on November 28th, or Black Friday. It's the biggest shopping day of the year, the day after Thanksgiving, when all the biggest sales happen to prepare for the holiday season. Ashley and April planned to meet up so they could talk about what they wanted to do moving forward. However, the day before they planned to meet, they decided to postpone the conversation. Unfortunately, they would never get the chance to mend the relationship, because just before 8 a.m. on November 28th, Black Friday, a 911 call came in from the River Ranch Apartments in the suburb of Fort Worth, Texas. That's the apartment complex where Ashley lived. One of her neighbors, Patrick Sweet, who lived directly below her, knew her and was friends with her. He had woken up around 7:30 that morning to loud voices and a hard thump right above him. A few minutes later, he heard Ashley's front door shut, so he figured she was going to work. Patrick rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but before he could, his carbon monoxide alarm started to go off. He was confused, so he began to investigate. This is when he noticed that there was water leaking from the ceiling of his bathroom. Putting two and two together, Patrick believed there could be a fire in Ashley's apartment, so he quickly called 911 to report it. Now I have a little bit of this audio I'm going to play for you now.
Fire department, what's the address of your emergency? Yeah, hi, I'm gonna live over at River Ranch Apartments. I think there's a fire upstairs in the apartment above me. Stay with me, I'll get someone in there out.
Patrick was not the only one who noticed something was wrong. By the time he was dressed and headed outside, a small crowd had started to form. Among them were friends of Ashley's, all wondering what was going on. One friend, Jeff Kaiser, decided not to wait for the fire department when he saw where the fire was coming from. It was his friend, 31-year-old Ashley Harris's apartment. He ran up to her door, looking through the windows to see if she was inside. Just as he was about to attempt to open the door, one of the on-site maintenance workers came running upstairs and helped Jeff kick the door down. Immediately, Ashley's dog, Nala, came darting out of the apartment, and luckily she was caught by bystanders before she could get very far. Now, Jeff and that worker made 3 attempts to enter the apartment and search for Ashley. They kept having to run back to the front door to catch their breath each time before trying to go back because the smoke was so thick and water was spraying from the sprinkler system. Jeff yelled for Ashley as he crawled midway into the apartment to the kitchen before the smoke forced him to go back out for fresh air. They had seconds to search with each attempt, but the smoke was too overpowering for them to make any progress. I'm actually impressed with their efforts, risking their own lives for another human being. By 8 a.m., the fire department was on the scene. When Fort Worth Fire Department Lieutenant Jared Pavko arrived, a resident told him that there was a possibility that someone was inside the apartment. But at that point, everyone who knew Ashley believed she was already on her way to work, considering it was Black Friday, the biggest shopping day of the year. They assumed she wasn't going to miss that, and they thought the fire had somehow started after she left for work. Maybe the stove was left on, a straightening iron, a candle, or something like that. But they were all trying to get a hold of her and let her know what was going on, but no one could get a response. They thought maybe she was busy opening the store. At least that's what they hoped. Firefighters were entirely unprepared for the scene that they would find inside Ashley's apartment. Once the blaze had been put out, the fire lieutenant could tell that the fire had started in the bedroom, specifically on the bed, which had been badly damaged. He opened a window to the room to allow all the smoke to clear. It was easy for firefighters to tell that this fire was not an accident and that they needed to call the Fort Worth Police Department and get an arson inspector on the scene. Not just because they suspected foul play when it came to the fire, but because of what they found in the middle of the bedroom floor. In front of the bed, on the floor, was a lifeless body of a female, and they could tell she did not die as a result of the fire. The fire lieutenant grabbed her arm, and that's when he noticed that her wrists were duct-taped. She had been bound and badly beaten. After he was unable to detect a pulse, he radioed for a request for the police and the CSI to come to his location. Then, the team quickly retreated out of the apartment to preserve it as a crime scene. Ashley's friends were still waiting outside for some sort of update, and they weren't sure what to make of the firefighters' behavior. It wasn't until police showed up and began to put crime scene tape around the building that it began to dawn on them that maybe they weren't able to reach Ashley because she had been inside when the fire started. Laura Love remembers how much she used to love Black Friday before that day in 2014. It used to be her favorite day of the year. She loved to go shopping and she loved a great deal. But that year changed everything. She got a call from a friend telling her that Ashley's apartment was on fire, and Laura was shocked. By 8:45 a.m., Wallace E. Hood Jr., a veteran arson investigator with the Fort Worth Fire Department, was on the scene. By that time, the fire in the apartment had already been extinguished, and during his investigation, he located multiple origins of the fire, including the bed, on the victim's body, and in the closet. He noticed the smoke detector had actually been removed and was underneath the mattress. In his professional analysis of the scene, He believed the ignition source was some form of open flame, such as a match or a cigarette lighter. He ruled out all accidental sources of ignition, concluding that this fire was set on purpose. As a matter of fact, he located an empty bottle of rubbing alcohol found on the floor in the bedroom. There were also some liquid stains burned into the bed frame, as well as burn marks in a liquid pattern on the victim's body. It looked like the rubbing alcohol was used as an accelerant and poured directly on the various points of origin to start the fire. Typically, though, most arsonists will not use rubbing alcohol for this purpose because it doesn't burn fast enough, long enough, or hot enough to truly be effective. He also added that he thought the fire might have actually been an afterthought, or at least not part of the person's original plan. Wallace believed this for two reasons. The first was the use of that rubbing alcohol as an accelerant, which again is not typical. And the second was that the sprinklers in the apartment were obvious. If someone had planned to set a fire and actually put thought into it, they would have looked for the sprinklers. These sprinklers helped stop the fire before it even burned away the evidence, so they would have knocked them down or maybe not even started the fire at all. The investigators thanked him for his time and used his findings as the foundation for their criminal investigation. One thing was for sure, this was an arson, and it looked like the fire was set to cover up a murder. Next, the homicide investigators were called in when Fort Worth detective Jerry Cedillo, who was on call that weekend for Thanksgiving, and his partner Ernie Pate arrived at the River Ranch Apartments where Ashlea lived around 10:22 a.m. There was a crowd of her loved ones outside, 40 to 50 of her friends, family, and co-workers, standing outside the apartment. These detectives were not expecting that, and they had to get the situation under control. They were all waiting for news about Ashlea. They wanted information, but they would have to wait. Once the scene was cordoned off and secured, the detectives made their way upstairs and into Ashlea's unit. Detective Cedillo looked around in the living room, which was already decorated for Christmas with a tree and holiday pillows and even wrapping paper stacked up next to a wall, like Ashlea had been in the middle of wrapping gifts. But the detective didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, nothing that indicated a struggle had occurred in that area. But of course, he was directed toward Ashlea's bedroom, and he was immediately confronted with the sight of the victim lying on the ground. He could tell that her hands had been duct-taped behind her back, and her ankles were duct-taped as well. She had been bludgeoned and suffered serious head and face trauma, possibly even tortured. They carefully turned over her body, and that's when they saw that her throat had actually been cut, and she had been set on fire. There was evidence of a very violent struggle. This was a gruesome murder. There was so much blood that had soaked into the carpet and actually appeared to have dyed it red. The detectives began to look around the apartment for clues and to collect and mark evidence. Ashlea's makeup bag and her wallet were lying open on her bathroom counter. Detectives matched the driver's license picture to the victim and preliminarily identified her as Ashlea Ann Harris. It didn't take long for the news of this fire to spread throughout the community, and word got to Ashlea's best friend, Stephanie Naylor. Just like Laura Love, Stephanie got a call from a mutual friend telling her that Ashlea's apartment was on fire. She was like, "What do you mean?" So she raced over, concerned about her friend's well-being, and joined that growing crowd. Among the people there was Ashlea's boss from American Eagle, Chris Cravey, and he kept asking authorities if he could speak to Ashlea, but the response they received was that she was unavailable at the moment. So hours went by and they were still waiting, assuming that Ashlea had already been taken care of or was being interviewed about the blaze. But all that hope was dashed when the coroner's vehicle pulled up. Chris Cravey lost it. He knew what it meant in that moment. At the same time, the detectives walked towards the crowd and began asking them questions. The very first question brought Ashlea's best friend, Stephanie, to her knees. Detective Cedillo asked if Jeremiah 29 verse 11 meant anything to them. Stephanie fell to the ground. Her knees just gave out from under her. She responded, "That's Ashlea's tattoo." Ashlea was known for her tattoos, and she had already been preliminarily identified by her license, but also by a tattoo she had on the side of her body. her first initial and last name. But Ashley also had that scripture from Jeremiah 29 verse 11 tattooed, and it read, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." But Ashley did not have a future. Her life had ended. And those words seemed so empty when all hope is gone and no future remains for Ashley. Her friends knew she was dead, but they didn't know how this could have happened. This is when the next phase of the investigation started. There were dozens of potential witnesses just waiting right outside, and they would need to interview all of them before they started to slip away. So, police directed everyone who was waiting outside to go into the apartment's leasing office and made it clear that anyone who tried to leave without their permission would be arrested for not cooperating with the police investigation. One person was missing from the scene: Ashley's girlfriend, April. Now, remember, they had taken a break, and they were initially supposed to reconnect that day to talk about their future together. That conversation was supposedly called off, but now Ashley is dead. So of course, one of the people on scene texted April around 1 o'clock that afternoon and simply asked her if she'd heard about the fire in her apartment. Not too long after that, someone else texted April with "Call me." She made that call. She was terrified that something happened to Nala, Ashley's dog, assuming that Ashley was at work. So she asked, "Is Nala okay?" And the friend said yes. So April asked, "Well, where's Ashley?" And that's when the friend simply said, "Ashley is gone." Well, this didn't register with April. She was like, gone from where the apartment. So she was like, "Well, is she okay?" And that's when the friend was more clear. She said, "No, Ashley is dead." April was in total disbelief. She just threw her phone across the room because she did not believe this could be true. Now, Ashley's mom, Monica, and her stepfather, Chuck, were out of town when all this was happening. Initially, they were informed that a fire had broken out at Ashley's apartment complex, but they had very limited information and hoped Ashley's unit was not affected. But then, Chuck got a call from Ashley's biological father, Tommy Harris. Tommy had been informed by detectives that Ashley had been killed, and now he had the heartbreaking job of relaying this message to Ashley's mother and stepfather. Monica saw Chuck wiping tears away from his face as he spoke on the phone, and she knew that her prayers for Ashley's safety had not been answered. This was just the beginning of the horrifying news this family would receive. Next to receive the news was Ashley's sister, Melissa. Chuck tried calling her but didn't get an answer, so he left a message with her husband. He ended up calling Melissa, and by the tone of his voice, she knew that something was wrong. So she shouted, "What happened to my mom?" thinking, at her mother's age, that it could have possibly been an accident or that she had died. But that's when she heard him say, "It's not your mom, it's Ashley." She was not expecting to hear that. It was unbelievable. And at this point, the family had limited information about what had happened to their loved one. It would be much worse than they could have ever imagined. Back at the scene, investigators were questioning Ashley's friends. Detective Cedillo noted that in the wallet where Ashley's ID was found, her credit and debit cards and cash were still inside, and no other high-value items were taken from her apartment. It seemed like the motive was definitely not robbery. So, to Cedillo, this meant that whoever murdered Ashley had known her personally, because they had to have had an alternative motive, and that appeared to be much deeper from the viciousness of this crime. In order to get to the bottom of this, he decided it was time to question those witnesses. One of them was Alexis Torres. She explained that she had seen Ashley the previous afternoon at a gathering with friends on Thanksgiving Day. According to her, Ashley had to work on Thanksgiving in order to prep the store, American Eagle, for Black Friday. It was going to be a rush the next day. Ashley was scheduled to work from 6 p.m. to 3 o'clock in the morning. The mall actually closed at 8 p.m., but the after-hours Black Friday preparations would then begin thereafter, and she would most likely not get off work until after 3 o'clock. So their group of friends decided to have an early Thanksgiving dinner so that Ashley could attend. Now, during dinner, Alexis had agreed to go over to Ashley's apartment during her shift to stay with Nala. This was not a strange request. Everyone knew how much Nala meant to Ashley, and she wouldn't want to leave her alone too long. Ashley finally arrived back home from work at around 3:40 a.m. in those early morning hours of November 28th, and Alexis was there to greet her. They visited with one another in Ashley's apartment until about 4:45 in the morning. At that point, Ashley needed some sleep because she told Alexis she had to take a nap before waking up and heading right back into work for Black Friday. Alexis also told Detective Cedillo that Ashley had asked her to stay over, but she couldn't because she had her dad's truck that night and needed to take it back to him. That was the last time she saw Ashley. Alexis said she remembers Ashley locking the door when she left. Then about 2 hours later at 6:56 a.m., Ashley attempted to call Alexis, but she missed the call. So, about 2 to 3 minutes later, when she noticed she had a missed call from Ashley, Alexis said she tried to call her back, but she was unsuccessful in reaching her. If Alexis's story is true, then that meant whoever committed this heinous crime had done so between the hours of 6:56 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. that morning, and that's not a big window of opportunity. So, Cedillo decided to keep his eye on Alexis, but he knew he had a lot more interviewing to do. Now remember the man who called 911? Patrick Sweet. Well, when he was interviewed by detectives, he provided some very crucial information, much more than he did on that 911 call. On the morning of November 28th, he was awakened by what sounded like a scream, and then he glanced at his clock, which showed it was 7:30 a.m. This was only about 30 minutes from the time that Alexis missed Ashley's call. So Patrick laid in bed, wondering what was going on upstairs, and that's when he heard a loud thud right above him and could hear labored breathing. Patrick was sitting there thinking, "What should I do?" And that's when he heard Ashley's front door close. He was thinking it was her going to work. So he got up and looked outside for confirmation, and he did this because what he heard was concerning. When Patrick looked out the window, he saw a darkly tinted black Infiniti driving away, and that was not the vehicle that Ashley drove. But not wanting to assume the worst, he figured maybe a friend or a coworker of hers had picked her up for work. So he laid back down and tried to go back to sleep. But before he could, his carbon monoxide detector went off. So now he went to check his apartment for problems, and that's when he noticed that water was dripping from his ceiling in the bathroom. This was from the automatic sprinkler system, and it was triggered by the smoke and fire. He figured it must be happening upstairs since it wasn't happening in his unit. And that is when he called 911. But why hadn't he mentioned the screams? Well, he told detectives that after calling 911, he then took some of his belongings and moved his car across the street away from the apartment building. Before firefighters arrived, he saw a neighbor from the back of the building and one of the maintenance men enter Ashley's apartment. At that point, he was unaware that Ashley was inside until later when he saw the looks on the firefighters' faces. At that point, he realized that the noises he heard earlier were out of the ordinary, and that's why he told detectives about them. I know no one wants to assume the worst, but if you hear something like that, I would encourage you to just call 911. I know that sometimes operators will give you a hard time if you didn't see anything, but it's better they come out and check, because you'd rather be safe than sorry. Now detectives interviewed Jeff Kaiser, the friend who kicked in Ashley's door with the maintenance person. He said he woke up to the sound of fire alarms that same morning. He quickly got dressed and ran over to the building where Ashley lived. He saw her truck parked outside, so when a neighbor said they thought that smoke was coming from her unit, Jeff didn't hesitate. He ran upstairs and kicked open her door. Jeff said the door was locked and the deadbolts were engaged, which was actually interesting to detectives. How did the killer gain entry to her apartment if her doors were locked? But now they have another clue. Ashley's white Dodge pickup. Detective Cedillo wanted to search inside, but the keys to that vehicle were missing. They searched the apartment but couldn't find where Ashley kept them or had put them. Could the killer have taken them and then locked Ashley's door behind them? It was a possibility. The crime scene was still being processed, so for now, Detective Cedillo moved on and interviewed another neighbor, Stephen Lee. He was a former law enforcement officer who lived right downstairs and diagonally across from Ashley. According to Stephen, he had the very same routine every morning. He would go outside and smoke a cigarette around 7 Arkangs. Man, just watch the parking lot. He did this every day. Due to his background as an officer, he said he found it peaceful. That morning, he noticed one car that didn't belong. It was a black Infiniti G35 with a faded toll tag sticker on the roof, and it was parked right next to Ashley's white pickup truck. While this car stuck out to him, and he had never seen it in the parking lot before, he wasn't actually suspicious because it was the holidays, and anyone could be there visiting family or friends. But Steven said the car was still parked there when he left for work around 7:30 a.m. But recall that Patrick also noticed this car and said it was driving away sometime after 7:30, because that's when he first woke up to those screams. So now, Cedillo goes back to the people he already interviewed and asks them if they knew anything about a black Infiniti. They said no. However, Alexis passed this information on to Chris Cravey, who was still waiting in the crowd. Now, earlier that morning, one of his other assistant managers had called him to say that Ashley had not shown up for her shift, and they couldn't get a hold of her. They had also heard a rumor that her apartment might be on fire. So, Chris rushed over there to her complex, hoping that he could help Ashley in some way. But of course, we know what happened after he arrived. When he hears this new information, his heart sank, and he ran as fast as he could to speak with detectives. Chris was confident he knew whose car that was. Chris tells Cedillo he had a former employee who drove a black Infiniti G35. Their name was Carter Cervantes. To Cedillo's surprise, Chris makes him aware that Carter is a 25-year-old woman. Many people who live in this area work at establishments nearby, like the mall. But Chris tells Cedillo that Carter worked at the Amarillo, Texas location. That's actually 5 hours away. So now it seemed even more of a remote possibility that this woman could have been all the way over in Fort Worth. Many people drive Infiniti G35s, it's one of the most popular models. So, Cedillo thanks Chris for this information, but then goes back to focus on the evidence at the crime scene. He was there until after 1:30 that morning. It had been a long day, so Cedillo decided to head home and get some sleep before continuing with the investigation. However, no matter what he tried to do, he could not stop thinking about this case. So, in the early morning hours, he decided he'd had enough, and he got up to start his day. He had nothing to go on except the name Chris had given him of the woman who drove that black Infiniti. So he decided to look her up, and he found her address. To his surprise, she was living approximately 2 miles from Ashley's apartment, so this could mean it was normal for her to be in that area. Maybe she was visiting a friend, or maybe she was connected to the crime. She was already connected to Ashley through the fact that they both worked at American Eagle. So, Cedillo figured that he would dig deeper. He decided to drive by that address on file in the early morning hours of Saturday, November 29th, but there was no sign of a black Infiniti in the parking complex. So, Cedillo decided to wait outside for Carter to emerge from her residence. Meanwhile, he called Chris for all the information he had on this former employee. Chris explained that, initially, Carter was hired at the location in Amarillo, Texas, and she worked there for a considerable amount of time. By the time she was 24, she had worked her way up to an assistant manager. From what Chris gathered from other employees, Carter was nice to your face and tried to be your friend, but you actually wanted to be on her good side. Because once she had something against you, it seemed like she would do whatever it took to make sure you were working in a living hell. Lots of drama surrounded her when it came to her interactions with other store employees. While she wasn't anyone's favorite manager, nothing too major happened. It was kind of the usual office gossip. There were no rules broken until Carter hired 19-year-old David Mallory. Not only did she give him special preferential treatment, but it was rumored that the two of them were romantically involved, which was against the rules. She was his superior. She was in charge of his payroll, his schedule, who he worked with, and it wasn't allowed. When word traveled to their district manager, Carter was given 2 choices: quit or get transferred to another location. This wasn't that out of the ordinary. It happens. People meet at work and get involved with one another. And Carter wasn't a terrible employee, so they gave her those options. She chose to move to a different location, That way both she and her new boyfriend could remain gainfully employed and stay together. For whatever reason, Carter decided to move 6 hours away to work at the Fort Worth American Eagle location at the Hewlin Mall, the same location that Ashlea was working at as an assistant manager as well. Now, employment for Carter's much younger boyfriend at the Amarillo location did not last very long. Maybe he was only working there to be close to Carter, because after she left, he missed 3 shifts in a row, which means you get automatically terminated. He was put in their system as not suitable for rehire at any American Eagle location. Eventually, he moved in with Carter all the way in Fort Worth. Soon after Carter began working at the location, word got around to Chris that Carter had something against Ashlea, who was loved by everyone. She was regarded as the mother of that store. Chris thought Ashlea was a phenomenal employee, so he inquired about this supposed tension. Lindsay Green, another American Eagle employee, told Chris she believed that Carter saw Ashlea as her competition because Carter was trying to catch the attention of the district manager so that she could get a promotion. Well, that's not that out of the ordinary. It's pretty normal that there's some sort of competition between employees. But then, in June 2014, Chris had to take a leave of absence for medical reasons, and since he knew Ashlea longer, he trusted her to manage the store while he was gone. She was temporarily moved into a management position and was appointed to run the entire store. Well, that didn't seem to go over well with Carter, but Chris was back from surgery before any problems occurred. However, while Chris was out, Carter found a very creative way to circumvent the American Eagle system. She was able to hire her boyfriend David at the Fort Worth location. What did she do? She just altered David's social security number in the database, making it look like he was a brand new employee, so that do not hire alert didn't show up. None of the employees at the store knew David, so it never raised any red flags. But then, just 2 months later, in August on the 24th, the Fort Worth location was robbed. Remember, this happened the day after tax-free weekend, and I told you that once a year, Texas allows people to purchase their items tax-free. It's one of the busiest times of year for retail stores like American Eagle. The day after the money was collected and still in the safe, Chris tells Cedillo that Yasmin was the one who found the safe open with $188,000 missing when she opened the store the following morning. The footage showed an individual walk straight to the safe and open it. The thing is, you had to have a key in order to gain access. This meant this person was in possession of one of the store keys because they easily opened it, took the money, and walked right out of the store. They knew it had to be someone who worked at American Eagle, either in the past or present, because they didn't trip the alarm or even have to search around. They just went straight to where they knew the money would be. Remember, Ashlea was interested in possibly working with loss prevention, so she diligently looked over that video footage from 1:14 on August 24th. Upon further investigation, the key was found left inside the safe, and it belonged to an assistant manager named Yasmin. But Yasmin had not closed the store the night before the theft occurred, and she didn't appear to be the person in the video. It was apparent that the back door had been left open just a crack, which allowed this individual to enter. Now, everyone believed this had to be an inside job. Given all of this evidence, Ashlea was confident that the person who came inside was David Mallory, and, by extension, Carter, since she was his girlfriend, and she had closed the store the night before. Yasmin informed Chris that she had left her store keys unattended on a table for approximately 5 minutes the previous day while Carter was in that area folding jeans. Later that night, at closing, Carter insisted on being the one to take out the trash, even though normally she assigned that task to someone else. The trash was taken out through the back door, and when she came back inside, they noticed she failed to secure the door on purpose. It made perfect sense. Also, when they called the police and also called Carter that morning to tell her they needed all hands on deck, Carter responded with, "I don't know what the big deal is. Insurance can cover this." And until this point, Chris had been completely unaware that Carter had hired David to work at the store. Once all these pieces came together, Chris and Ashlea informed Carter she was suspended until further notice. She calmly handed over her store keys and then just exited the store. Then, 1 week later, Chris called Carter and told her she had been terminated for leaving the store unsecured. She was really upset and requested the regional manager's phone number. Despite everyone believing that Carter and David were responsible, they were never arrested or formally declared suspects. In fact, this incident would have probably been insignificant to the case at hand if it wasn't for the fact that Ashley was the one to say something about thinking this was Carter. And even though she was never charged with theft, she was let go from her position at the company. And after this, David did it again. He stopped showing up for his shifts and was fired, just like he had been at the other location. After hearing all this, the detective was more sure than ever that they were on the right track. Based on his findings, he put in an application for 2 search warrants. The first was for David and Carter's cell phone records, and the second was for their vehicles. The evidence found in both would be shocking, but for now, it was a waiting game. Cedillo and his partner, Ernie Pate, were outside in their vehicles, parked in Carter's parking lot. They identified a white Cadillac that matched the license plate and description of the one David owned. Now, Cedillo had his eyes on both cars as he waited. 4 hours later, at 7:45 a.m., he saw the lights on the black Infiniti flash, like someone had remotely unlocked the doors. Sure enough, Cedillo observed Carter and David emerge from the complex and walk through the parking lot towards the vehicle. David got in the driver's seat, and Carter jumped in beside him in the passenger side. Then they drove away, with Cedillo following close behind in an unmarked car. The detectives could not believe where they were headed. They pulled right into the parking lot of the Hulen Mall, which is where the American Eagle store was, where Ashley worked. Cedillo was automatically suspicious. I mean, they were driving to where a murder victim was last seen before she returned home, to be killed and set on fire. Not to mention, it's where 2 people had been accused of robbing 2 months earlier. So Cedillo knew it was also too early for mall patrons to be inside. The only people inside would be employees. He knew that both David and Carter had been fired from their jobs at American Eagle, so why were they headed there? When David parked the car, only Carter got out and walked into the mall by herself, wearing black pants, shoes, a black scarf, and a dark gray sweatshirt. Cedillo parked his car and followed Carter, while Pate stayed back to question David. When questioned, David told Detective Pate that he drove Carter over to the mall so she could fill out new employee paperwork at the Aeropostale store. She had recently been hired there. Pate relayed this information to Cedillo as he proceeded inside the mall to see if it was true, while Pate stayed with David. That's when he learned that David was driving without a license, which is a misdemeanor in Texas, so he was able to take David into custody. Their goal was to talk to him and secure the black Infiniti for analysis. They were still waiting on search warrants to be approved. Meanwhile, Cedillo was speaking with the manager at Aeropostale, who was telling him he had no idea who Carter was and had definitely not hired her. This confirmed the detective's suspicions, and he headed for American Eagle to see if he could find Carter there. His thought was that she was there to rob the store after the biggest sale of the year, when the most money would be in that safe. Carter's former co-workers had told Chris that she had once joked that if she were ever going to steal a deposit, it would be on Black Friday or tax-free weekend. Well, we know that she and David possibly already took that $118,000 on tax-free weekend. So Cedillo was convinced she was trying to get her hands on even more cash. Retail stores can bring in anywhere from $7,000 to even over $100,000 in cash after Black Friday, and Carter knew that. But instead of finding Carter at the front of American Eagle, he found Chris waiting outside a locked gate. He asked Chris, "Why aren't you opening the door?" And he said, well, the corporate office had changed the lock after hearing about Ashley's murder, and he was waiting on someone to bring him the new key. Now, Detective Cedillo was kind of caught off guard. The reason for this was that he had made sure not to tell anyone that the only thing missing from Ashley's apartment was her key ring. Only law enforcement knew that information. On that ring was the key to her truck, which was still in the parking lot, her keys to her apartment, and her keys to the American Eagle store. All of them were missing. And of course, detectives noted that her apartment door had been locked before her neighbor broke it down. This confirmed that whoever killed Ashley had also stolen her keys. Cedillo had put two and two together. Carter knew Ashley had the keys to the store since she was the other assistant manager. It was all coming together. Cedillo asked Chris why the locks were changed since he hadn't told Chris that Ashley's keys were gone. And Chris explained, no, this is company policy. The locks are always changed after a key holder dies or is fired. To Cedillo, he thought it was most likely that whoever stole the keys didn't know about this policy when they took them, and that person was most likely Carter. Cedillo asked Chris if he happened to see Carter walk by, and he said he had not. Well, Cedillo felt like he was on the right track. He headed back to Carter's apartment complex to try to track her down, and it didn't take him long to find her. She was in the business office of the complex, where the laundry facilities were located, and she was no longer wearing her black baggy clothes. Instead, she was in bright pink scrubs. She willingly went back to the police station for questioning. Now, Cedillo started with very simple questions, just small talk. One of the first ones was whether she went by Carter or Carol, and she said Carter. Carol was her middle name. This woman was calm, she was pleasant, she appeared to be educated and well-spoken, and she also didn't seem to know why she was being questioned. She actually asked Cedillo why she was there, and he explained there had been a recent attempt at a robbery in the mall, and anyone who was there that day had to be questioned. Carter seemed to calm down after this, and then Cedillo eased back into the interview or interrogation. He asked Carter what she did for Thanksgiving and what she ate, and Carter just happily responded, "All about the turkey I made. There was stuffing, mashed potatoes, and green beans casserole, and this cabbage bacon salad that my mother really likes to make. But I don't think David liked it very much."
I made turkey, and there was stuffing and mashed potatoes and green bean casserole, and this cabbage bacon salad that my mom really likes to make, but I don't think David liked it very much.
Cedillo asked her where she went to school, and she said she attended West Texas A&M University. He wanted to know what brought her to Fort Worth, and she explained that she had a job opportunity with American Eagle. He knew there was much more to that story, but at the time of the interview, Cedillo didn't question her much about her answer. Carter actually admitted she was let go in September due to leaving a door unlocked, which allowed a robber to gain access to the store. She also said she was the manager of the store, which was not true. Now, she told Cedillo she was doing volunteer work at a local hospital, thus explaining her scrubs. Instead of pressing her on any of the things he knew about David and Carter stealing from American Eagle, he asked her what she and her boyfriend did after Thanksgiving dinner. Carter told him they watched movies until they went to bed. She seemed so ordinary and so innocent in this interview, but at that point, Cedillo's questioning got a little more serious. He asked Carter to walk him through what she had done that morning. She told him she woke up around 7:30 or 7:45. She said she talked to David for a little while, then went back to sleep. When she woke up, David wasn't there. Well, Cedillo knew this was a straight-up lie, so he let her know that. But Carter denied she was lying. She said, "How is that a lie?" And Cedillo responded, "You know how I know it's a lie? Because I saw you come out of your apartment and get into your car with David. That's how I know it's a lie."
Morning.
Okay,
All right.
this morning,
Okay. What time do you get up?
about 7:30,
Okay.
7:45.
And then what happens then?
And then we talked, and I went back to sleep. When I woke up, he wasn't there.
Okay. I know that's a lie.
No, it's not.
You know why I know it's a lie?
Why do you know it's
Because
a lie?
I saw you come out of your apartment and get in the passenger seat of that car, and I saw him drive out of there. That's why I know it's a lie.
Carter became irritated, saying that she knew what she did that morning. She wasn't lying, and she knew where she went. She wasn't giving in to Cedillo's persistence, even though he told her she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life by lying to him. But she just wouldn't quit. She said, "No, I got up this morning, put the laundry in, I went to check my email, and that's it."
I got up, I went and put the laundry in, and I went and checked my email. That's all. You found me on my apartment complex.
At this point, Detective Cedillo had had enough, so he left the room. This was a chance to leave Carter all alone and observe her actions. She did something very strange and telling. She took a sip from a water bottle, then kind of looked at it and immediately put it down on the table. She spilled some out on purpose, grabbed a tissue, and acted like she was cleaning it up, only wiping the part where she put her mouth on it. To Cedillo, this meant she was worried that they were going to try to get a sample of her DNA and possibly find a match somewhere at the crime scene. It still wasn't hard proof of anything, though. So, Detective Cedillo saw David in the hallway at the police station. He initially thought he was wearing a toboggan, but it turned out to be a ski mask, and it was apparently in new condition, without any noticeable wear, with a plastic price tag fastener still attached. I'll get to why this is important. Photographs were taken of David, and they showed that he had a fresh injury to his lower lip, which was swollen. Unfortunately, at this point in time, Cedillo had nothing but a bad feeling, so he couldn't hold them there. David was processed on his misdemeanor charge, and then he and Carter were free to go. But by this time, the search warrant for the apartment that the couple resided in, as well as their cars and their cell phones, had gone through. They had more than enough probable cause after these interviews, and I told you the evidence would be shocking. But before I tell you the details, I want to tell you about Ashlea's autopsy results. Dr. Richard Fry, a deputy medical examiner at the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office, performed the autopsy on Ashlea's body. The autopsy revealed she had numerous injuries, and I didn't want to leave any of them out. She had a laceration on the right side of her scalp, a small cut with a surrounding bruise also on the right side of her scalp, a patterned bruise on the right side of her face, a bruise right between her eyes, another bruise around her left eye, a small incision across the bridge of her nose, a laceration across her right cheek with a bruise surrounding that area, a scrape on the right side of her nose and her upper lip, a bruise on her right upper lip, a laceration on the left side of her face, a scrape and a laceration on both of her lips, a scrape mark on her chin, a star-shaped laceration with a surrounding bruise behind her left ear, which was consistent with being pistol-whipped, a cut on the right side of her neck caused by a knife or sharp-bladed weapon, a bruise on the right side of her neck, bruises and abrasions on the left side of her neck. She also had petechiae, or broken blood vessels, on her neck, in her eyes, and on her throat area. She had a bruise on the front of her chest, a bruise on her right arm, a scrape on that elbow, a bruise on the back of her left arm, a bruise on the back of her left hand, another bruise at the base of her left thumb, which was likely due to the duct tape that was around her wrist. She also had an abrasion on her left pinky finger, a cut inside her upper lip, additional lacerations and bruises on the inner lower lip, and most notably, fractured C1 cartilage in her neck. Now, Dr. Fry concluded that the injuries observed on different parts of Ashlea's face indicated they were caused by multiple blows. He explained that the petechiae in her eyes reflected asphyxia or strangulation, and this would have occurred by someone actually tying a cord or rope around her neck and squeezing tightly. According to the doctor, it would take quite a while and quite a bit of pressure for someone to be fully asphyxiated. And this fracture in this part of her neck was the least common place where they see fractures from asphyxia or strangulation-type deaths. It's because it consists of cartilage that's pliable. He explained that these kinds of fractures are mostly seen in motor vehicle accidents or something involving a very significant amount of force. The sample of Ashlea's aortic blood that Dr. Fry tested was negative for carbon monoxide. This indicated that Ashlea was not alive when the fire was set. But since there were burn marks on her body that were not made by a taser, someone intentionally attempted to set her body on fire after she was deceased. Dr. Fry concluded that Ashlea's cause of death was asphyxia and blunt force trauma to her head and neck, and the manner of death was, of course, a homicide. All of this was incredibly horrific. This poor woman, it's unreal that a human being could do this to another human being. And over what? Well, money, of course, because that seemed to be the motive in this case. The first search that was conducted was of David and Carter's apartment. During the first search on November 29th, Detective Matthew Barron with the Fort Worth Police Department Homicide Unit saw a plastic tub near the front door. It contained bungee cords, rope, and he found a lock located in the kitchen drawer. In the trash, he found a box associated with a taser and a charging cord, which is why I brought it up in the medical examiner's report, stating there were no taser marks on Ashlea's body. Detective Barron also found some strands of duct tape, which were collected and analyzed to see if they matched the duct tape found on Ashlea's wrists and ankles. A damaged deadbolt lock was found in the apartment, along with 2 additional locks that had apparently been for practice. It included one conveniently labeled lock-picking practice lock. But there was something else found during this search of the apartment, a significant discovery: credit card receipts. This led investigators to these locations listed on the receipts, and through footage captured on CCTV, the detectives were able to determine that on November 21st, just days before Ashlea's murder, Carter was seen on video purchasing several items that appeared to be part of what they call a murder kit. Things like short-handed shovels, gloves, a tarp, and duct tape. I wondered if their plan had been even deeper, because why did they need shovels? I think there should be some kind of silent alarm or something that goes off when someone buys too many incriminating items all at once. But I guess one could argue you need those for some everyday gardening or home improvements. I still think that somehow stores should keep track of that. But now, under the search of Carter's black Infiniti, which was conducted by Officer J.J. Jeans with the Fort Worth Police Department Crime Scene Unit, he took photos of items that were found in the vehicle. These included a plastic bag inside a black trash bag, a sharpening stone for a knife, a 9mm card, a cell phone, a walkie-talkie, several knives. One was a folding pocket knife, another was a buck knife with a sheath, a plastic tub with some men's boots that had what looked like blood on them, and another cell phone inside those boots, some clothing, a toboggan with a hole cut in it, a tarp still inside its package, and a kitchen knife. Then, under the driver's seat, Officer Jeans found a loaded Glock 19 with a bullet in the chamber. The officer also found various documents in the car, including a receipt reflecting an order from a lockpicker's mall for a cutaway practice lock that was sent to the address of the apartment where the couple lived, and we know that one was found there. There was also a lockpicking instruction manual found during the search of the vehicle, and the floor mat from the driver's side revealed what looked like the presence of blood, so it was sent to the lab for analysis, along with those men's boots. When they searched David's Cadillac, they opened the trunk and found that pair of shovels that Carter had been seen purchasing. And guess what? They had been used. There was dirt on both of them, as well as bungee cords and zip ties in the back, and a box of plastic sheeting and a box of Craftsman sockets. To seal it up, this looked like all the items you would need to wrap up a dead body. But we know they never got that chance with Ashlea. So, was there a second victim that we didn't know about? Now on to the cell phones. In the photo roll for both David and Carter's phones, there were pictures of Ashlea's apartment complex, including photos of her front door. Clearly, they had been casing her apartment complex weeks before the murder. Then, when they looked through texts between the couple, things got worse. The two seemed to be texting about their plan to hurt Ashlea, but they were doing it so casually, like they were talking about having dinner. At one point, Carter says that she just picked up the supplies including zip ties, bungee cords, shovels, and a plastic tarp. The key about these text messages, though, was that they were purposely vague. No one text message had enough to implicate them in a crime. For example, a special agent with the FBI and a member of the Cellular Analysis Survey team found a text between David and Carter's phones that was sent at 11:52 a.m. on November 28th, which was hours after Ashlea was found dead. Here is how that exchange went. Carter texted, "Hey, remember that thing you said I didn't clean well? Did you clean it? Did we leave it behind?" David responded, "We left it. I didn't touch it." Carter texts back, "Well, damn, that's not good. Take out all the trash and leave that." Then, 5 minutes go by, and Carter texts David again, saying, "David, I need to take care of that. I'm so sorry I forgot." If all of this wasn't enough, there was one more piece that fell into place after the contents of David's cell phone were analyzed even further. One of the text messages he sent to Carter from his phone contained latitude and longitude coordinates. After entering them into Google Earth, Detective Cedillo drove to that specific location, which was near Lutters, Texas. When he arrived at the intersection of the coordinates, he discovered a hole in the ground, which he described as a prepared human grave. It was approximately 6 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. That is unbelievable. Based on everything they had gathered, this is what they believed happened. After Carter was fired, she and David started to plot revenge on Ashlea. They decided they were going to kill her and take her keys so they could break into American Eagle again. The pair chose Black Friday because Carter knew that was when the safe would have the most money inside. So, in the early morning hours of November 28th, Carter and David both entered Ashlea's apartment. She could have still been awake from the time Alexis left around 5 a.m., but we know she told her she was going to try to take a nap. Either way, when the couple entered, Ashlea was alerted, and a fight ensued. Ashlea put up more resistance than they expected, which resulted in excessive force used by the couple. Not only was Ashlea pistol-whipped and stabbed, her throat had also been slit. Because more time had passed than they had imagined, and the fight was more intense than they anticipated, they changed their original plan. They decided not to bury Ashlea, but instead to start a fire at the last minute, as an afterthought, just like the fire inspector predicted. On the way out, they took Ashlea's keys and locked her front door. Later that morning, when Carter went to the mall, she planned on quickly getting into the American Eagle safe using Ashlea's key. She was going to grab the money and then quickly change out of her darker clothes into the pink scrubs she was found in later. However, she didn't anticipate that those locks would be changed so soon. She left the mall and saw David being questioned by the police, so she walked home alone to confirm his suspicions. Cedillo has the mall pull footage from inside American Eagle and outside in the parking lot, and sure enough, they see a person who matches Carter's height and body type, dressed in black pants and wearing a gray sweatshirt with a black scarf and something wrapped around their face. The person is swiftly walking up to the roll-down gate in front of American Eagle around 8 time, on the morning after Black Friday and the day after Ashlea was found dead. This person kneels down and tries to unlock the lock, clearly not knowing that Corpet had changed the locks after Ashlea's body was found. Once they realize the key didn't work, they quickly get up and walk away. Now, on the footage from the exterior of the mall, it catches a person matching Carter's description, now wearing those same pink scrubs and that gray sweatshirt wrapped around her waist, the same exact outfit she was seen wearing at her apartment complex when Cedillo brought her in for questioning. So it's her. It stands to reason it's also her inside trying to unlock that gate. She changed real quick before exiting the mall and escaped before anyone could catch her. She walked all the way back to her apartment. After gathering all of this evidence, Detective Cedillo secured an arrest warrant for both Carter and David. On December 4th, 2014, they were charged with capital murder. Shortly after the arrest warrant was secured, a second search was conducted on Carter's apartment. This time, a business-type key was found in the kitchen trash can. This key opened the dressing rooms and the storage closet at American Eagle in the mall. The key was not in the trash during the first search of the apartment, most likely because Carter was still in possession of it at the time. 2 days later, on December 6th, David was taken into custody, and later that day, Carter turned herself in with her lawyer present as a show of good faith. At this point, does it really matter? But I guess she had to do something. Both were booked and given $500,000 bond while they awaited their trial. They were tried separately, but the evidence presented was almost exactly the same. The only difference was in their defenses, which I'll get to in a moment because I think it's pretty interesting. The prosecution showed that there was no difference between the fibers, the adhesive, the backing, the width, or the color of the duct tape found in the trash at Carter's and the duct tape found on Ashlea's body, so they could have originated from the same roll. The swabs of blood taken from the floor mat and the infinity revealed that the partial major DNA profile originated from Ashlea Harris. Her blood was also found on the boots in the car, which suggested David traced it from her apartment to the front seat as he got in and drove away. The DNA profile obtained from the swab of the grip of the Glock 19 that was found in the Infinity was a mixture of David and Ashlea's DNA. Carter was excluded as the contributor, which suggested that David had used the gun to pistol whip Ashlea. I told you the evidence in both trials was the same, but the defenses were different. Well, despite her lawyer's protests, Carter wanted to take the stand and testify. She presented a very different story than the one the prosecution had laid out. She claimed that she only acted under David's orders and that she was scared of him. According to Carter, even when they lived back in their hometown, David had power over her. He controlled what she ate, what she drank, when she slept, and he forced her to rehire him when she moved to Fort Worth.
I was very afraid of David. I thought he was going to kill me, telling me what to drink, what to eat, and he made me have sex with him in the movie theater.
He had masterminded the original robbery as well. On the day that Ashlea was killed, she said she woke up and David was nowhere to be found. When he eventually came home, he handed her the American Eagle keys and told her she needed to go to that store and take the deposit. At first, she said she refused, but then he pointed the gun in her face and said it again. Carter claimed she again refused, but according to her, David became even more sinister. He told her he would kill her, and on top of that, there was someone sitting outside her parents' house right then and there. She had to do exactly what he said, or her and her parents would die.
He gave me some gloves, told me to put them on, and then he handed me a set of American Eagle keys, and he said, go in and open the gate, bring me that fat-ass deposit, and he just pointed it at me. I shook my head, said I wasn't going to do it. And he said, you don't understand. If you don't go in, I'm going to kill them, and then I'm going to kill you.
She felt like at that point, she had no other choice but to steal the money. She described how upset she was when she realized the locks had been changed, but she said it was because she didn't know what David would do when he found out. Carter concluded her version of the story by making a startling revelation to the court. She claimed that David had brought two individuals that she referred to as ghetto men into her house with the intention of sexually violating her. His shocking allegation was apparently part of David's plan to silence her regarding the details of Ashlea's murder.
Somebody pushed me down right when I got into the apartment. He said, I'll make her follow directions. He took off my sweatpants, he pulled them down to my ankles, and they raped me. I was screaming.
Carter even tried to explain away her actions at the police station, specifically wiping down that water bottle. According to her, that was not an attempt to remove her DNA evidence. Instead, she clarified it was an act driven by a powerful memory of the violation she experienced, which caused her to feel the need to eliminate any lingering scent associated with the traumatic experience. A nice try, but she could have been an actress instead of a wannabe criminal mastermind. She might be able to cry on cue, but she was an amateur when it came to being a murderer. She left a ton of evidence behind. Her story didn't explain the text messages she exchanged, which dated back weeks before the murder. There were also messages after the murder that indicated she had been present in the apartment, even though she said she was never there during Ashlea's murder. In the end, the jury did not believe her story, and it sealed her fate. It took the jury less than 2 hours to deliberate before they unanimously agreed on a verdict of guilty for Carter. The defense attempted to pin everything on Carter, but the jury saw through this desperate attempt to excuse away such horrific actions, and they found him guilty of Ashlea's murder. Both he and his little girlfriend were handed identical sentences of life in prison without the possibility of parole. They were so young, and so was Ashlea. They all had so much of their lives to live. I don't understand the reasoning and the thinking. I know that they're young, 19 and 25 years old, but why would you ever think that money is worth taking someone's life? Not even thinking about your future, spending the rest of your life in prison. This is only a small bit of justice. Ashlea deserves so much more. Her family wanted to see them get the death penalty, but they understood it doesn't always work that way. They were grateful to all the law enforcement officers involved for seeing it all the way through to the end. They were glad that Ashley's killers were behind bars. For her mother, Monica, she holds on to the memory of the last time she saw Ashley. It was a week before her murder. She had called her mom and asked her to come play bingo. Monica almost didn't go. She felt like she had so much on her plate. But she listened to her gut and decided to spend time with her daughter. She will forever be grateful that she did. She'll always remember walking in and seeing the big smile on Ashley's face and telling her, "I love you," one last time. Nowadays, Monica tries to remember her daughter in a very unique way. Even though she initially struggled with Ashley's sexuality, she embraced the women in her life who loved her so much. Her ex-girlfriends, Laura and April. Monica takes both of them to the bingo hall on a regular basis. April has even mentioned that sometimes Monica will refer to her as her daughter. For all of them, when they gather together, they truly feel like Ashley is still with them. In light of everything that happened to her, many of her closest friends believe that her tattoo of that Bible verse is very upsetting. I read it to you in the beginning. It's Jeremiah 29 verse 11, and it reads, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." A few of Ashley's friends have mentioned that she talked about feeling like she was going to die young. She couldn't explain why she felt that way or when, but she thought it was going to happen. She just believed that it was true. No one really knows what to make of this or her chosen verse to tattoo on her body. They just know that Ashley was a beautiful soul who was taken too soon from this world. Life seems perfect. You fall in love, get married, and live a lavish life in San Diego, California. You feel safe at home, unaware that someone has been watching, patiently waiting to strike. It won't be revealed who they are until 40 years have passed. Today's case brings us to beautiful Southern California, specifically La Jolla, California. And it's not Lala, it's La Jolla. If you speak Spanish, let me know if it's true that it translates to the jewel. No one is quite sure who or what inspired the name, but the origin of the name La Jolla is disputed by residents and historians. Some believe that the city's name came from an Indian term, which meant hole in the mountains. Nevertheless, it's one of California's most popular beach destinations because it is just breathtaking. The oceanfront views. La Jolla is in San Diego, and it lives up to its nickname of the Jewel due to its natural beauty, its various activities, and its luxury lifestyle. Since 1900, La Jolla's population has increased significantly from its initial 350 residents. After the soldiers returned from World War II, many of them flocked to La Jolla with their families, and new houses had to be built quickly as the old horse trails were paved. Sprawling communities arose on the mountain slopes. Over 50,000 people lived in La Jolla by 1960, and there are currently over 40,000 residents living there today. It's still considered a very small, close-knit community. Today, La Jolla boasts over 200 sunny days, more than 100,000 merchants, and 101 restaurants. It's also home to nearly 300 seals and sea lions. The popularity of La Jolla as a seaside destination attracts wildlife enthusiasts, beachgoers, surfers, divers, and sea lovers. In 1978, CBS News 8 described La Jolla in an article highlighting the area as the good life. Although the town of La Jolla was praised for its coastline, shopping, and restaurants, only 1 year later, in 1979, it would be shaken by a brutal, senseless murder. Now that I've set the stage for where this case takes place, I'd like to introduce you to the Beckers, Michael and Barbara, and their two young sons, aged 9 and 7. Barbara Ruth Pepper was born on October 21, 1941, in Pennsylvania, where she met the man of her dreams who would become her husband, Michael Becker. Michael graduated with a master's degree from the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania in 1965, and within a year, he completed his internship in internal medicine at Barnes Hospital at Washington University Medical Center in St. Louis, Missouri. Michael and Barbara moved to San Diego, California in 1970, where Michael worked as a rheumatology fellow at the University of California, San Diego, and at the VA hospital. Barbara and Michael had 2 sons, whom they loved very much. They were Barbara's world. Barbara was an upstanding member of her community. She was very active, athletic, and very pretty. She would attend local events, watch her son's soccer games, and was fully dedicated to being a housewife and a stay-at-home mom to her boys. She was always running around doing errands, and anytime anyone saw her, they would see her with a smile on her face. She even played on a football team with other women from her husband's hospital where he worked. She loved life, especially her life, and she had a very good life. She and Michael lived in a very affluent neighborhood, kind of off the beaten path, and they were able to afford this home, which is now estimated at $4 million, because Michael Becker was a prominent UC San Diego medical professor and doctor. The neighborhood they lived in was close to UC San Diego and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I want you to take a look at this house. I don't know if it was different back when Michael and Barbara were living in it, but look at it now. It is big, with lots of windows. Who knows if these hedges were here before? I do know there were hedges, I just don't know if they were this tall, but it's got a big yard, it's on this nice corner lot with a lot of space, and it has a 2-car garage here on the left side and a couple of ways to access the home from the street. The neighborhood has a few dead ends, you can see them here. There are 3, and a major road leading into this is Torrey Pines Road. It is a very residential area, and the Becker's home is to the back, close to this dead end, also close to this big area out back full of nature, as far as the eye can see, until you get to the aquarium where all that underwater wildlife lives. See their house off Burrow Avenue and Glenwick Lane, right there on the corner? There are several homes right in front and around their house. Like most of us, the Beckers had a routine. Every weekday morning, the boys would take the bus to school, and every afternoon, they would take the bus home. Dr. Becker would go to work at the Veterans Hospital, and Barbara would run errands, carry out daily housework, meet with friends, make lunch for the boys, then prepare dinner when Michael came home, and the routine would repeat itself. They knew what to expect, except when things didn't go as planned. On Wednesday, March 21, 1979, the morning began as usual, with the boys heading off to school and Dr. Becker going to work at the VA hospital, which was only 5 minutes away from their home. Barbara stayed home, doing her normal everyday chores and housework. It was when Barbara's 2 young sons came home that the Becker family's normal routine was shattered. The boys returned from school at 1:30 in the afternoon. They usually entered the house through the side garage door, expecting it to be unlocked as usual, so they could walk right in and be greeted by their mother. Except this time, the door was locked. They looked over and saw their mom's Volvo station wagon parked in the driveway, which usually meant she was home. It was unusual that the door would be locked. So, they decided to walk to the front door, hoping that Barbara had accidentally locked the side door but left the front door unlocked for them. After trying the knob on the front door, they were in luck. It was unlocked. The 2 boys entered the house, but it turned out it wasn't luck, it was absolute devastation. That afternoon, these poor little boys witnessed something that no one should ever have to see, a sight that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had expected their mother to greet them, but it was silent inside. Their normally active mother was not running towards them with open arms, asking about their day. Instead, as the boys entered the living room, they stumbled upon a gruesome discovery. They found their mother's body lying lifeless on the floor, with blood all around her. No one can be certain if these young boys knew exactly what they had just seen, but they knew enough to realize that something horrific had happened to their mother. They immediately ran out of the house, screaming for help. They banged on a neighbor's door until they got a response. Once the little boys calmed down enough, they were able to explain to the neighbor what they had found in their home. The neighbor called the San Diego Police Department, who sent out patrol officers, as they were the closest to the home at the time. Now, it can be frustrating to hear how this case played out because we're talking about the late 70s here. The way police departments handled murder cases was much different back then. And that's why I actually find these cases so interesting. It's fascinating to see how far techniques and technology have come. But these patrol officers who were first on the scene had gathered as much information as they could from dispatch and entered Barbara Becker's house on Glenwood Lane through that unlocked front door that her boys had entered. Their job was to make sure that this was not an active situation, that no perpetrator was inside the home, then secure this as a crime scene, setting up things like crime scene tape, things of that nature. The neighbor who called the police had actually gone inside Barbara's home. They wanted to understand what the boys had related to them. But once the patrol officers had arrived, everyone was out of the house. This is an example of the layout of the home. When you come through that front entryway, the living room was off to the left. The kitchen is right here, to the right of that, followed by a family room and then the garage. To the right of the entryway was a long hallway. It consisted of a bedroom on the right of that hall, with a dining room on the left. As you move further down, there was a den on the left, a bathroom on the right, followed by a couple of bedrooms towards the end of the hall, including the master bedroom. Initially, when the officers saw the scene, they thought that Barbara had taken her own life, but after a closer inspection, it was apparent that someone else had done this to her. When I say done this, it wasn't exactly obvious what had happened. There was just a lot of blood. It was everywhere, and there were obvious signs of a struggle. They soon realized they needed to alert the homicide department. They knew they were going to need everything at that scene to be preserved. So they stopped, turned around, and waited for the homicide investigators to arrive. When this crime occurred, the San Diego Police Department only had 4 homicide investigators, but these men were diligent and they followed procedures to the T. Upon their arrival, they walked through this affluent M. Hoya home while observing the crime scene. All 4 investigators moved in a single file line. This was protocol back then. It may still be used today, I'm not sure, but walking in a single file line ensured that no evidence was touched that could later prove to be helpful to them. It meant less trampling over evidence or creating shoe impressions where there shouldn't be. Yes, there would be some contamination, it's inevitable, but they tried their very best to contain it to a very small area, as small as possible. This wasn't the day and age when they used shoe covers or high-tech PPE. It was just one foot in front of the other. Before they even came across Barbara's body, they could tell a struggle ensued by the fact that a small table was overturned and missing one of its legs. The house that Barbara kept was very organized and tidy, so when things were out of place, they definitely stood out. You can see the table right here, and it's definitely out of place. Investigators finally reached Barbara. She was lying on her back in the living room. She was close to a television that investigators determined should not have been on the floor, another sign that there was an altercation between her and the assailant. Even without seeing a weapon at this time, they knew that this was a stabbing death. It was apparent from the massive amount of blood underneath Barbara on the carpeted floor and from the wounds left on her body. As they got closer, it was even more heartbreaking. The sheer amount of violence that had to have happened here stunned these veteran officers. Barbara was fully clothed. Her clothing did not appear to be torn or ripped, and what that signified was that, at that point, they didn't believe that this was a sexually motivated crime. She did have visible stab wounds on various parts of her body, and investigators knew that Barbara fought hard for her life. She had a number of defensive wounds. So what happened? Who would have brutally stabbed a stay-at-home mom in a quiet, affluent suburban neighborhood? And not just stabbed, but slayed this woman? And I want to get into more of that during the review of the autopsy report. But at this moment, detectives were still conducting a walkthrough to document everything that they could see and photograph as much as possible. The crime scene would never look like this again. It's important to do a thorough walkthrough to make sure nothing is left out when it comes to documenting everything that they saw. I do have some pictures to show you of what the scene looked like, but let me explain what they were seeing first. Most notably, they saw a kitchen knife. It was about 10 feet away from Barbara's body. I feel like we don't see this as much anymore with the advances in technology. I think it's way less common for a killer to leave the murder weapon behind, and it appeared as if the person who did this was walking away with it and then decided to drop it as they walked out of the living room and away from Barbara's body. It was located on the carpet next to the sofa, and there was blood on both the handle and the blade. The thing is, there was a blood trail going into other areas of this home, and the investigators deduced that this trail could not have been made by Barbara. They don't think that the knife was still in the killer's hands, dripping blood onto the carpet as they walked away. So, this meant the killer must have been injured, and that it was their blood being left behind. Cutting oneself in the commission of a stabbing is very common. Blood is slippery, and with the force necessary to make such impactful wounds, many times the killer loses grip and the knife slips, and they cut themselves, especially when they use something like a kitchen knife with a sleek handle with no traction. They most were not wearing gloves for that extra grip either. From where they're standing, investigators can see a trail of blood leading from the living room to the left into the kitchen. There are blood droplets on the floor, and there are also smears on the countertops and other areas all over the kitchen. They also noted that the dishwasher was wide open. You can see it here. This may have been where the knife was retrieved, or Barbara may have been possibly getting ready to unload it when the attacker came inside. It definitely appeared that the attacker was trying to stop their blood and maybe wrap up their injured arm or hand. There was a bloody towel on the kitchen table, and in the sink there was a wet bloody paper towel that was thrown on a cooking pot. There were blood smears all over the sink area as well. The trail continued into the bathroom, which was down the hall adjacent to the kitchen. Even more blood droplets were found on the floor in there, as well as bloody toilet paper on the floor. They were most likely trying to stop the bleeding before this person fled. There was bloody toilet paper in the toilet as well, which was unflushed, and blood covering the sink. Every bloody tissue and paper towel investigators believe the suspect touched was preserved and saved as evidence, but it wasn't processed or analyzed the same way it would be today, which is very interesting to me. With these older cases, it was so much harder to figure out who committed a crime like this unless you had an eyewitness. It's fascinating to me that the blood was collected to conduct a blood test, and I'm talking about the ones you get at a doctor's office to determine what blood type you are. I was in awe over this, and this was the biggest lead you could get when it came to blood evidence, or DNA, if you will. I have more to say about this, but there was no way for them to match DNA to an actual person back then. It was only to determine the blood type, so that if and when they did get a potential suspect, they could take that person's blood and then rule them out if they didn't have the same blood type. That's not really that great when it comes to pinpointing the actual perpetrator, but it's what they had at the time. After the detectives walked the scene and observed each room and documented their findings, they reconvened to talk about potential motives. One thing they agreed on was that because of the amount of blood at the crime scene and the number of wounds on Barbara, the person who did this wanted to ensure that she was dead. That was the goal before they left the house. But why? Well, there were theories. They believed the suspect, ECT, was a male, and even narrowed it down to a white male, just because of the statistics they had at the time. This was one, possibly a burglar gone wrong. Maybe someone cased the neighborhood. They knew everyone's schedule. They knew Barbara was going to be alone during the work days, and that the kids were at school. So they thought this was the perfect opportunity to strike, but maybe they weren't aware of how strong and fierce Barbara would be. She's 37 years old and active, and it might have caught him off guard when she fought back. He met her with a fight, and it escalated until he grabbed a knife and ended Barbara's life. Or two, it could be that someone was stalking Barbara instead of casing the house to commit a robbery. Perhaps it was Barbara that they were after. They could have snuck in from the open side door that the boys usually used, grabbed a knife, threatened Barbara with it, and as they tried to force themselves on her, she resisted. That's what made this assailant fight back, and ultimately, he cornered her in that living room, where he ended up ending her life. The third theory was that this was just a very deranged person, full of rage, who was on some kind of killing frenzy. They were just out for blood, and Barbara was an easy target because she was a female alone in her home with an unlocked door. Regardless of the theories, they had limited time. They needed to get moving. Back in those days, the first 24 to 48 hours were even more important than they are now. Their evidence could be walking away, and someone could have seen something, and they might lose the opportunity to talk to them. With only 4 detectives on this case, they divided the workload. Each one of them had their own duties. One would be responsible for taking notes and photos and working more with the crime scene. Another would canvass the neighborhood. Another would notify and interview family and friends. And the last of the 4 would correspond with headquarters. But they would all work together and reconvene at the end of the day to share information. It's just so crazy to think that there were no cell phones back then, that nobody could have caught the assailant on video. Even video surveillance, I don't know if it was slim to none. I mean, there weren't Ring cameras. There weren't doors that officers could go to and say, "Hey, can we see the footage from today?" That just didn't exist. Their best bet was that someone saw something out of the ordinary and would remember seeing it. But I will say, back then, people didn't have as many distractions, like scrolling social media all day, for example. So they did have more time and an opportunity to have their eyes open and see something. At this point, investigators can't rule out any possibilities. They have to follow each tip and each lead carefully to see where they lead them. The San Diego Police Department had one of the highest murder solve rates in the nation in 1979. So they assumed that Barbara's murder would be another easy slam dunk for them. Back then, like I said, that first 48 hours was even more critical. During the first 2 days following a crime, investigators worked on nothing but that case for 2 days straight. Sometimes they wouldn't even sleep. The more information an investigator can gather after a murder, the better chance they have of catching their suspect, because eyewitness statements will be fresh in their minds. No matter how low the police department's resources were, homicide investigations were taken very seriously. One terrifying aspect of this case is that the killer was on the loose. There could be a serial killer about to take their next victim. Investigators knew that once they began to canvass this neighborhood, all of the residents would be aware that a murder took place, and word would travel fast. This would inject fear into the community and put more pressure on the already taxed law enforcement agency. The detective tasked with conducting the canvass went door to door, asking anyone if they heard anything, if they saw anything out of the ordinary in the day or the days leading up to the murder. Investigators were kind of intrigued by the fact that the murderer would have chosen this area. It was tranquil. It was off the main roads, not easily accessible for through traffic. There had to be intent to drive into this area. It wasn't like you would accidentally find yourself lost within it. The only people who would normally be walking around or driving down these streets were the residents. The typical crime in this area was usually petty burglary or a drunk driver. Nothing had been as horrific or brutal as what happened to Barbara Becker. Not that anyone working this case could recall anyway. All the residents were stunned. It did not seem real. The detective was getting more questions than answers because everyone he talked to wanted to know what happened. Investigators contacted every single neighbor on every street in that neighborhood and received just a few tips that seemed even remotely promising. One witness told investigators they saw a person who looked like a housekeeper, and she was visiting several houses in the area. Another neighbor reported seeing landscapers that were cutting Barbara's bushes in the days before her death, along with a crew of workers. So a number of people were there. These were both really good leads. Perhaps this woman that they saw going door to door was casing the neighborhood, or maybe someone who was cutting the grass at Barbara's became obsessed with her. Next, they had to track down these individuals for questioning. Meanwhile, another detective's job was to notify Barbara's family, but he also sought out to interview anyone close to her because most violent crimes, especially ones like this, are committed by someone the victim knew, someone close to them, someone with a reason to harm them. The first call they made was to Barbara's husband. He was at work when they called him, and he was made aware of what was going on by default. He's also their #1 suspect right now. When they informed him of what occurred, his emotions were raw. He wanted to know how it happened. He actually hung up on them and raced home to be with his wife. However, when he arrived on the scene, he was met by the detectives, and he cooperated. They asked him about everything he did that day, starting from that morning. Dr. Michael Becker told investigators that he left his house somewhere around 8:20 in the morning to drive one of his sons to school. They both usually rode their bikes together, but that morning, Michael took one of them himself before heading into work at the hospital. Kind of peculiar, but okay. He said after he dropped off his son at school, he headed back to the hospital to work, and he was there all day long until their call. He's actually the head of one of the entire departments at the hospital, so it was going to be pretty easy to verify his alibi if it were true. He also told them that Barbara had told him she had a hair appointment at 10 o'clock that morning. At that point, the detectives had to get personal with Michael. One of the biggest reasons that someone's wife is killed is usually because of a domestic issue. So, even though this is an upstanding doctor in the community, detectives want to know, and they ask point blank whether Michael or his wife were sleeping with other people or if they were in an unhappy marriage. He says no. He said he and Barbara were very happy, there were no issues in their marriage, and he had nothing to do with this. He was devastated. He was shocked by this news, and it was obvious to investigators. They do use their gut feelings to gauge whether or not someone's guilty or innocent, but it felt like when they were trying to gauge his reaction that he was innocent. They believed him. They still had to check his alibi. After all, he was only a short drive away. There wasn't GPS tracking on a cell phone to know his exact movements. He could have dropped his son off, gone back to the house, killed his wife, and then gone to work all day. Or could he have left work sometime during the day? Anything is possible. Investigators went into the hospital and talked to his colleagues, and they were able to confirm Michael's story. He was at work by 9 o'clock, and he was seeing patients back to back all day. He was never seen leaving the hospital at any time. Furthermore, none of his colleagues said that they ever witnessed anything that would make them believe that there were any marital issues in regard to the Beckers. The crime scene was still being processed, and the leads from the neighborhood canvass were being followed up on. Meanwhile, the autopsy report was completed immediately following the investigators' thorough inspection of the house. The coroner arrived to preserve Barbara's body before she was transferred to the medical examiner's office. The coroner covered Barbara's hands and feet with plastic bags to save fibers or skin from under her fingernails. This is crucial when someone fights back. Even if it's not apparent visually speaking, there could be evidence that cannot be seen with the naked eye underneath the fingernails. They don't want any of that to fall off, so the hands are securely bagged for transport. The medical examiner performed an autopsy on Barbara's body just a day after her murder. One of the 4 investigators from the San Diego Police Department was there to observe this entire examination. He was taking notes and photographs of her entire body. During Barbara's autopsy, horrific details were revealed. The medical examiner identified 8 stab wounds to Barbara's throat. Her murderer attempted to use the dull kitchen knife as a saw. There were 7 back and forth strokes on her neck that reached her backbone, and that's heartbreaking. Barbara also had wounds on the sides of her head, which were so deep that her skull was showing, and some of the most horrific injuries were actually on her hands and fingers. They were sliced to the bone as her murderer was swiping that knife at her. Barbara was trying to shield herself, but to no avail. She was no match for that blade. Barbara's cause of death was determined to be what is known as exsanguination, extreme blood loss. Consequently, the manner of death was classified as homicide, which is pretty obvious to all of us, but they have to make these findings official. As those 48 hours were coming to a close, the crime scene was still being scoured. Investigators also tracked down the men who were working on Barbara's home, trimming her hedges, and all of them cooperated with investigators, and were cleared of any suspicion. They also confirmed that the woman seen going door to door was a housekeeper for a family in La Jolla, and her husband routinely drove her to work and dropped her off, so they were both cleared as well. Now, back at the crime scene during this time, investigators were not collecting blood evidence and DNA evidence because they would use it to detect the suspect. That was way off. That was a long time from happening. Instead, the investigators and law enforcement officers would focus on fibers, fingerprints, and hair evidence, and the blood, like I said, would be collected to type the blood. Laboratory technicians analyzed all the blood stains and the clothing that Barbara wore for any hairs, fibers, or trace evidence collected by investigators at this crime scene. As much evidence as possible was collected and preserved in case a suspect appeared, so that one day they could match it to him. But without another set of fingerprints, you can't match fingerprints. Without a person's blood type, you can't match the blood type. And without a person's hair, you can't match the hair. So all of this is pretty useless at this point. They still had to preserve it. Even though they had the killer's blood in 1979, they couldn't do much with it. The lack of DNA testing at the time made typing the blood the only option. Forensic blood typing works as follows. If the blood at the crime scene is type A, then anyone with, let's say, type O negative, like me, would be excluded as a suspect. If the blood found at the crime scene was type O negative, then anyone with that blood would be a suspect, but that would mean 40% of the population. Although it wasn't as good as DNA testing, it was all these investigators had at the time. I can't even imagine because it sounds so silly now that we know the capabilities we have now. Even though the process could strongly link a suspect to the crime, it couldn't prove guilt. In most cases, the method was used by law enforcement to eliminate suspects from a crime instead of pinpointing them, because that would be obvious. Like I said, if the blood type was A and you are type O negative, you're probably not the killer, right? You're not the killer. In an article published by the Los Angeles Times in May of 1979, the San Diego Police Department expressed their confusion over the decrease in domestic homicides. So instead of a husband killing a wife, something else was happening. Before 1979, there were many crimes of passion, and law enforcement would respond to these areas. There were partners killing each other, and when they arrived, there was pretty much a smoking gun, literally. It was easy for law enforcement to solve these types of crimes, because there you had it, the husband with a knife in his hand, the husband with a gun in his hand. But starting in 1979, these cases were getting even more complex, and they only got worse with time. Most of their unsolved cases, like that of Barbara Becker's murder, were crimes committed by a stranger, which made them difficult to resolve. Only one murder committed between January and May of 1979 was classified as a crime of passion. They also reported increased sexual-related crimes and robberies against women that escalated to murder. What was going on back then? I'm not sure, but the residents of La Jolla were terrified that a serial killer might be roaming their community. California was a hot spot for serial killers around the 1970s. Serial killers roaming the Golden State in the 1970s included the following, and some of these will be familiar to you. This will be a little bit of serial killer trivia, if you will. Angelo Buono and his adopted cousin Kenneth Bianchi were known as the Hillside Stranglers, and I hope I'm saying those names right. I'm probably not. They were convicted of killing 10 young women in Los Angeles between October 1977 and February 1978. I'm going to just put all of their names up on the screen. This is just so heartbreaking. They were between the ages of 15 and 28 years old. The two men would persuade their victims that they were undercover cops and then order them to get inside their Cadillac, which they claimed was an unmarked police car. Then they would drive them home, torture them, and murder them. Next on the list is Ed Kemper. You've probably heard of him before. His nickname is the Co-Ed Killer. He is so scary. He murdered a total of 10 people, including a 15-year-old girl as well as his own mother and her best friend, from May 1972 to April 1973. This was following his parole for murdering his paternal grandparents. Yes, he was only 15. He was sitting at the kitchen table when he got into a fight with his grandma, as children usually do with their elders. But little Ed was not normal. He ran off and got a rifle that he was supposed to be using for hunting, but he had been using it to shoot small animals in the neighborhood, so it was taken away from him. He knew where it was, and he got it. He stormed into that kitchen, pointed it at his nan, and pulled the trigger. That's just so heartbreaking. It was said that her last words were, "Oh, you better not be shooting the birds again," and unfortunately, he wasn't. When his granddad arrived home, he met him in the driveway and shot him as well. That is unbelievable to think that he was actually let out after that and went on to kill 8 more people, all women. He would pick up female students who were hitchhiking and take them to an isolated area where he would take their lives in many different ways that I cannot mention here, and then take them back to his home and have his way with them. Next up is Rodney Alcala, also known as the dating game killer. He was convicted of 5 murders committed in the state of California between 1977 and 1979. He received an additional sentence of 25 years to life after pleading guilty to 2 additional homicides committed in New York. While he was conclusively linked to 8 murders altogether, the true number of his victims remains unknown, and they think that it can be much higher, around 30. He was known to have a collection of more than 1,000 photographs of teens, young women, and boys, many in very explicit poses. It was believed that he would toy with his victims, play with them like toys, and asphyxiate them until they passed out, and then play with them again. It reminds me of Dahmer, even with the pictures. Rodney was dubbed the dating game killer because he actually appeared on a television show in 1978 called The Dating Game, and this was right in the middle of his murder spree. That's unreal to me. Last, I have to mention one of the most infamous, Joseph James D'Angelo. That name may not ring a bell, but how about the Golden State Killer? I bet you've heard of him before, right? That's Joseph James D'Angelo. He committed at least 13 murders, 51 instances of forcible rape, and 120 burglaries across California between 1974 and 1986. He is responsible for at least 3 separate crime sprees throughout California, and each one of them gave him a different nickname. When he was in the San Joaquin Valley, he was known as the Visalia Ransacker, before moving into the Sacramento area, where he became known as the East Area Rapist. Then, committing serial murders in Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange County, he was known as the Night Stalker, later the original Night Stalker because Richard Ramirez was also called the Night Stalker. He was caught with the help of a crime writer named Michelle McNamara, and if you haven't read the book or seen the documentary called I'll Be Gone in the Dark, it's a must. I do not want to give away what happens if you haven't seen it, but it was the first case to be solved using genetic genealogy, which, by the way, has become a buzzword lately with the University of Idaho murder case. We don't even have actual concrete press releases or official documents mentioning that this was utilized at all. Yes, news stations have said it. Yes, people on Twitter have said it. But instead, all this probable cause affidavit mentioned was the good old parental DNA. But this is for another day. Yes, all of these serial killers that I just mentioned could have committed Barbara Becker's murder, but investigators could not find any evidence linking them to her crime. The investigation turned cold despite all of their best efforts. Unlike some other investigators, the San Diego Police Department wasn't one to let cold cases remain unsolved. They would revisit Barbara's investigation files all the time to see if there was anything they could do to solve it. An excellent and dedicated team of homicide investigators was involved in this investigation. So, despite working on all these other murder cases, they would still drive to La Jolla and speak to Barbara's neighbors. They were hoping that someone would give them new information. Nevertheless, no one could ever recall anything that would lead these homicide investigators to a suspect. To check on the status of Barbara's investigation, her family contacted the homicide division every year or two for updates. Barbara's brother wrote letters all the time to investigators, but Barbara's husband, Michael, could not talk to them. He was still emotional, which is to be expected. However, of course, he eventually remarried and became a prominent rheumatologist who was responsible for extensive research into gout, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and how our genes affect those diseases. In the years that passed after Barbara Becker was murdered, she was always on the minds of the homicide investigators at the San Diego Police Department. She should have been safe. She was in her home. And if technology caught up, there was a potential to solve this case with the advancement of DNA technology. Investigators would test the DNA found at Barbara Becker's crime scene in hopes of finding a suspect. And things started to look up, because in the 1990s, CODIS was established. We hear the word CODIS all the time, and I always forget what it stands for, but it's the Combined DNA Index System. It's the FBI's criminal justice DNA database, and it contains DNA profiles contributed by federal and state laboratories. The computer software operates local, state, and national databases of DNA profiles of convicted offenders, as well as unsolved crime scene evidence and missing persons, all throughout the 50 states. So there is a lot in this CODIS system. It also automatically generates investigative leads, and it uses two indexes, the Convicted Offender Index and the Forensic Evidence Index, which both include biological evidence that is recovered from a crime scene. I know that sounded like a lot. It is very technical. It is science after all. But the DNA profiles of those convicted of crimes range from misdemeanors to murder, and they are contained in this database. A DNA profile is submitted by an investigator, and then it's automatically compared with anyone in the CODIS computer software. By matching profiles in this forensic index, crime scenes can be linked together, and that's how we can identify serial killers. The computer system does it for us. We don't have to sit there poring over documents trying to make links anymore. An investigator may be able to identify a suspect based on a match made between the forensic index and the convicted offender index. The CODIS system had many advantages for law enforcement, such as taking DNA samples immediately after arrest, rather than waiting for a conviction. Having DNA on file speeds up the investigation process. You can identify the suspects faster, and you can prevent innocent people from being wrongly convicted. If we did this more often and collected DNA upon arrest, and it isn't done everywhere, this would eliminate those who are innocent immediately. It would save more time and money because these faster identifications lead to a shorter investigation and quicker outcomes for victims and their families. However, like I said, not all states do this. A lot of times you don't get your DNA taken unless you are convicted. But things are changing. A lot is changing. However, CODIS came with some disadvantages, including incomplete DNA samples, which can be mistaken for someone else's DNA. Even so, at the time of Barbara Becker's cold case, they were willing to accept the method's slight disadvantages. Since CODIS was established, the San Diego Police Department started closing criminal cases like crazy. They were matching DNA from older cases with DNA of newly convicted felons. I feel like it's one of the best inventions when it comes to crime solving. The DNA profile of an unknown male was found in the blood in Barbara Becker's kitchen and in the bathroom, and that was submitted to CODIS. But once again, despite all of these efforts, they did not get a hit. Therefore, they feared they would never be able to provide Barbara's loved ones with the answers that they deserved. If this person had not committed another crime since Barbara's murder, they wouldn't be in the database, since it did not exist at the time of the crime. So anything he did before Barbara's murder would not have a way to have been recorded. However, let's jump to April of 2018, because new DNA technology profoundly impacted the criminal justice system, and the world was hearing about it, like we still are right now, because we are in it. They heard about it because of a significant arrest in California. We just discussed this one. The following years of diligent and dedicated investigation, the Golden State serial killer was finally apprehended on April 24, 2018. This man was a former Navy veteran, a former police officer, and a father. We should all know his real name by now, Joseph James D'Angelo. After several decades of eluding the police and taunting them, how did the investigators finally identify this murderer? Well, the cold case investigators used a revolutionary technology I told you about, forensic genetic genealogy. Since September 2021, Forensic genetic genealogy has uncovered over 100 murder and other criminal suspects and identified many Jane and John Does. These are victims without names. They went without names for so long. Now here's my chance to set the record straight about genetic genealogy, because it's complicated and it's being thrown around a lot in the media lately. Many people are misunderstanding what it is, and I understand it's truly hard to wrap my brain around it. But I truly try hard to understand things and get them right, so I hope I'm helping. Please pass it on after I explain. It's thought that our DNA is able to be used to solve crimes, and that is incorrect. Now you know that is not true. It is entirely illegal and a severe breach of privacy for any agency to take our DNA that's been submitted to these private companies and use it to match to an unsolved case. It would be great in some ways if these databases would open up for this DNA to be used for that purpose. For example, there are 12 million people that have submitted their DNA to 23andMe, including myself. Many people believe that using this DNA from these online databases violates their privacy rights, but strict rules have been established to protect us, to protect the public, especially when it comes to law enforcement. This can all be found on the 23andMe site. This is how 23andMe responds to law enforcement requests for customer information. It says, respect for customer privacy and transparency are the core principles that guide 23andMe's approach to responding to legal requests and maintaining customer trust. We will closely scrutinize all law enforcement requests, and we will only comply with court orders, subpoenas, search warrants, or other requests that we determine are legally valid. To date, we have not released any customer information to law enforcement. So, there you go. Now let me explain the truth. There are only two databases that openly allow authorities administrative access to run matches, and they are the genealogical databases, GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. I'm going to say it again. GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA provide genetic genealogy's investigative power. Now here's the thing, on GEDmatch, users can upload their DNA from any direct-to-consumer company such as Ancestry or 23andMe. So this is where I think it gets confusing. If you submit your DNA to 23andMe, you can get your raw data. I've done it. You can put that raw data into other databases, and you can put that into GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA if you want to be part of this revolutionary way to solve crimes. This innovative method of finding suspects is a lot easier now, thanks to the rise in consumer DNA products that I just mentioned. Now wait, let me go back because I want to explain what genetic genealogy is first, real fast. The word genealogy relates to studying or tracing the lines of family descent continuously from one ancestor. So when you see someone build out a family tree, they are mapping out genealogy. Wikipedia had an easy-to-understand definition of genealogy. It's the study of families, family history, and tracing of their lineages. Genealogists use oral interviews, historical records, genetic analysis, and other records to obtain information about a family and then try to find the kinship and pedigrees of its members. So, with that being said, you do not need DNA to make a family tree, and you usually don't have the DNA to create it. Professional genealogists use methods to trace back ancestry. They use many methods that I just mentioned. However, combining those techniques with one of the ancestors or relatives' DNA can speed up the process and make it more accurate. We're getting closer to the combined definition here of genetic genealogy, I promise. But it combines that genetic factor. Genes are what make us who we are, and our genes are made of DNA. So therefore, if we take the DNA from a crime scene and there's no matching CODIS, meaning this person has never committed a prior offense, we used to be at a loss. But now, with GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA databases, this unknown DNA can be run through all of the known DNA of all those individuals who decided to submit their DNA for this purpose. This opens up the door to partial DNA matches against this unknown sample at the crime scene. There are limitations, and I will explain. Currently, there are 1.45 million people in GEDmatch, and in Family Tree DNA, there's almost 1 million people. That's not even close to the power of 23andMe, but it's a lot better than having no one to compare this unknown DNA to, right? So when they put it into these databases, there's a potential to find a partial, maybe not even a partial, a slight match with someone somewhere that has some of the same DNA as the suspect, but it's usually someone related at a far greater distance, meaning a fifth cousin, not a father. It's not an easy task. If you do get this partial match, you're still clueless about how it connects to the suspect, and that's where the genealogy comes in. Now, these professionals who know how to make those family trees use this one person as their starting point. Then they begin to build out that family tree and deduce who this unknown individual can be. Let's say they get a family tree down to 5 male individuals, and they look at all their ages. Let's say there's one in their 20s, but the crime was committed 40 years ago. They're ruled out. They go back to the family tree to find someone older, eventually possibly finding someone that they think matches the age. That's when they start to research that person. Where did they live at the time of the crime? How old were they? Did they know the victim? It isn't easy because there's a lot of legwork to still be done on a case. But wait, just wait. Now that you have an idea of how this works, let's go back to Barbara's case. The cold case unit decided to work on investigations within the San Diego Police Department that they believed had enough DNA evidence preserved from way back when to use investigative genetic genealogy. So investigators searched through binders and binders, looking for specific cases that had a lot of DNA left behind by the suspect. In particular, they were specifically looking at stabbing cases, because that's when a perpetrator has more likelihood of cutting themselves during an attack, leaving behind their blood. As these cold case investigators were going through these binders, they found Barbara Becker's binder, and they were shocked at how much DNA evidence was still preserved. Thankfully, those investigators were so diligent. 4 men, that's their whole team, and they were able to diligently preserve this. So the cold case unit pulls Barbara Becker's file, examines all the blood stains found in the bathroom and the kitchen, and it had all been blood typed. It was confirmed to be male. Barbara, the victim, was female, so they determined that the unknown male blood belonged to the killer. They decided that this case had so much potential to be solved using genetic genealogy. Until the Golden State Killer was caught, Barbara's murderer had been on the run for almost 40 years. They thought that it was about time to give her family some answers, if they could. So they uploaded this DNA profile from Barbara's crime scene to GEDmatch. Their goal was to identify a distant cousin of the suspect and then build out the family tree. Then investigators would research the family to see if anyone was in the San Diego La Jolla area when Barbara was murdered in 1979. Before law enforcement can even access GEDmatch to search for a relative, they have to prove that they have exhausted all other investigative methods, such as CODIS, without success. Just so you know, in order for authorities to do this, they cannot do it secretly. They always have to present themselves as law enforcement, and they can only compare genetic markers. They cannot check for things like psychological risks or genetic diseases. That's off limits. I'm so glad that this exists and that it's being used the way it is, because to think that someone came into Barbara's home and did such an awful thing to her and just left to go about their normal life is just unfathomable to me. I don't understand how someone could be so heartless and just move on like nothing happened. When the suspect's DNA was entered into the database, it was determined that his ancestry was French-Canadian. This posed somewhat of an issue because these are American databases, so his family tree would be close to impossible to build out. However, over the decades, the French-Canadian family actually married into American families. Luckily, the suspect shared a little bit, just some of DNA, with a family whose last name was Chartrand. So they began building out this family tree, and finally, they had someone that seemed to match up. His name was Paul Jean Chartrand. But how did they figure this out? It honestly seems like witchcraft, but rest assured it is a science and investigative work. When they ran Paul's name for a background check, they found out he was living in San Diego when Barbara was murdered. Not only that, he owned a business in La Jolla, so that is a major lead. They aren't just picking anyone off this family tree, they have to make it make sense. He owned a carpet cleaning company a mere 3/4 of a mile away from Barbara's home, and Paul was out on bail awaiting trial for a charge for him forcing himself on a woman. This was around the time that Barbara was killed. This was enough for them to look deeper into who Paul was. They found out that Paul Jean Chartrand was born October 21, 1951, in Montreal, Canada, but he made his way to the United States. They were able to track down his ex-wife and 2 biological sons, who were currently living in Southern California. His family confirmed that he was living in San Diego at the time of Barbara's murder in 1979. As they looked deeper into his past, they found out he was a convicted offender, and you probably know what kind I'm talking about. I told you what he was out on bail for. Before they tracked him down to obtain a sample of his DNA to test it against their suspects, the investigators wanted to put together as much information as possible, including his potential motive. Since Paul was a sexual deviant, investigators decided this might be the motive for the murder. Maybe Barbara entered the carpet cleaning store as a customer, or she could have just been walking around in this neighborhood, shopping, doing her daily routine, and she caught his eye. There were not that many people living there, so it could be a very likely scenario. Then, this killer most likely followed Barbara, maybe even stalked her for some time, before finally he couldn't take it anymore, and he had to go one step further and carry out his dark fantasy. They believe he entered Barbara's house that March afternoon to kill her. They think he probably entered the house as she was getting ready for her hair appointment. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen, snuck up on her. But that's not to say that Barbara did anything wrong at all. This man chose to come inside a home that did not belong to him and to act out a disgusting crime. Paul's adult sons wanted to assist in the investigation, and other relatives of Paul were also very willing to help in any way they could. One of his sons graciously spoke to investigators, and they told him they thought it was his dad who committed Barbara's murder. They were shocked when his son replied that he was pretty sure his father was the killer. He told them that his father was mean, and as a child, Paul's son said that Paul would throw him against walls in their house. At this point, investigators were confident that they had their suspect. Their suspicions were confirmed once they compared the DNA profile found at the crime scene to that of Paul's son. It was a direct match. Exactly 40 years to the day after Barbara's murder, investigators found her killer. Paul would have been close to 30 at the time that he killed Barbara. This is what he looks like. And honestly, to me, he's just so unassuming. He even smiles in his photos. I wouldn't expect someone that looks like that to have done something like this. But there's an issue with making an arrest and getting Paul's DNA. His family gives them the bad news. Paul died in 1995. But this is just so disappointing because you want justice for what Paul did to Barbara. Paul died August 13, 1995, in Arizona at 43 years old. He had moved to Arizona right after Barbara's murder, and when he was out on bail, his bail was so low, it was just unjustified, especially for what he did. Barbara may still be alive today if he had been in jail back in 1979, like he should have been. However, they still will never know why Paul did what he did. They couldn't ask him, and they couldn't figure out why he would choose Barbara. The investigators finally contacted Barbara's husband to share the bittersweet news, and Dr. Becker appreciated the efforts that the San Diego Police Department put forth. After he informed his 2 sons and Barbara's brother about the information, he asked the media to please give them space and time. I actually could not find any of their names, so they really did honor their wishes. They did feel relieved that Barbara's killer was dead, since no one thought they could face this man who murdered her if they had to go to trial. A few days before the news was released that Barbara's murderer had been identified 40 years after her death, investigators contacted Paul's family. They appreciated the tip from law enforcement. The family was horrified to learn that Paul had been involved in a crime of this magnitude. The investigators who closed Barbara's case described his family as wonderful and helpful people. So I wanted you to remember this. So many times, we want to place blame on the family of a suspect or a killer, and rightfully so. They're the flesh and blood of this person who took someone's life. But the parents and children of a suspect or a killer are not responsible. They can't control what their relatives do. and usually they have no connection to their crimes whatsoever. It's devastating for them to know that their loved one was responsible for something like this, and they have to grieve as well. At the time of the press announcement that Paul was Barbara's killer, many of the homicide investigators who worked on her murder case over the years, 4 decades later, were retired, including Gary Gleon. But they were thrilled when they heard the news, and they were surprised because this Paul person had never been on their radar. They were commended for all their hard work in preserving and saving the evidence that was later used to give closure to Barbara's family 40 years later. And they should be very proud of what they did in her case. Investigators would not have been able to solve this crime without genetic genealogy. It is a vital tool, and it's going to be even more vital. The process is minimally intrusive to all the parties except the offender, and to think about how many cases it can be used to solve in the future. Investigators hope that they can provide other families with answers using genetic genealogy. Just back in 2009, there were several cold cases that were solved using genetic genealogy, including Barbara's. But there was Scott Martinez's family. They received answers in 2019 after he was repeatedly stabbed with a sword back in 2006. And it certainly will not be the last time that investigators strive to bring answers to families by using this technology. I am so sorry to Barbara's family, especially her 2 young sons. I hope that they were able to find joy in their lives despite such a horrific tragedy. I wanted to point out that it's been said, as I stated, that the suspect in custody right now connected to the University of Idaho case was found using genetic genealogy, but it's never been officially reported anywhere. Instead, in the probable cause affidavit, it explains that a single source of male DNA was recovered from a knife sheath that was found next to one of the victims, Maddie Mogan. That DNA was put through CODIS, and there was no match. However, they had ring camera footage of a white Hyundai Elantra speeding away from the scene at approximately 4:25 a.m., following the time that they believed the murders occurred. And they noticed it didn't have a front license plate. So when they were doing their investigation into all the white Elantras in that area, they got a hit on one of them that was involved in a traffic stop back in August, and it was registered in Pennsylvania at the time. Well, in the state of Pennsylvania, they do not require a front license plate, and that was a big clue. They tracked down the person listed on that traffic stop. His name was Brian Koberger. He lived less than 10 miles away from where the murders took place. So far, this is not genetic genealogy, it's just investigative work. Then, they obtained cell phone records and were able to pinpoint that his cell phone pinged off towers in the area of the murder at various times in the late hours of the night into the early morning hours, at least 12 times, before the murder. Suspiciously, it did not ping there when the murders were being committed, but it pinged at a tower close to Brian's apartment. Then it seemed to be shut off or in airplane mode, but then it starts to ping again after the murders, leaving the area of the crime. This is what truly led them to Brian as a potential suspect. They merely confirmed his identity with a parental DNA test through his father's DNA that they retrieved from the family's home back in the Poconos. When they tracked Brian's movements across the country right before Christmas, they tested items from the trash can, and that DNA matched at a 99.9% probability as being the father of the unknown DNA that they got from the crime scene. Brian is the only son in the Koberger family, so that's not genetic genealogy, it's a paternity test, if you will. I just wanted to clear that up. Not to say that there wasn't any genetic genealogy that they did in the case prior to testing Brian's father's DNA, but I hope that helped, along with all the information that I laid out about how this whole process works. Now maybe you can add your own 2 cents online when people drop the method of genetic genealogy.